first time to my knowledge that we've had a panel dealing with Mark, the Jewishness of Mark, which I think was one of the interesting takeaways for me is why has Mark been neglected when we compare it to, say, Matthew or Paul and what have you. So we do have some people from yesterday's panel with us. And James McGrath has kindly volunteered to provide some uh, reminiscing from yesterday, some insights, some impressions of the Mark panel. We'll then allow John von Maren also to chime in. After all, John was the one who set this wonderful panel together. And anyone else then can join in the conversation during the remainder of the time. We will then later on start at around, I'm on Central Time here. 10 a.m. is it? Eastern time? I can't remember. With the Revelation within Judaism panel. So James will allow you to share some insights. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? I had to relocate to someplace other than my office. I apologize for the bad lighting. But we'll try to provide some of my own impressions as well as some reflections and a bit of recap. As we begin this final day, it will be useful, first and foremost, to recall some key points from yesterday's presentations and discussion. But I think it will also be useful to trace some threads that have run through both days and highlight those, especially so we can keep an eye out for them continuing today. Yesterday's papers focused on some of the key issues and texts and stories in Mark that have been at the heart of discussion of the Jewish context of Christian origins and the so-called parting of the ways. Jesus keeping kosher, purity, imperialism, Rome, the so-called trial of Jesus, the blaming of Jewish leaders for his death, Mark's Jewish literary style, and more. Each of these themes was explored in a way that explained, to use a phrase from day one of this conference, how texts that came to be used for anti-Jewish purposes could have arisen within Judaism. Helen Bond offered an especially helpful reading of Mark as offering what other Jewish literature in the post-70 period offered, an explanation of the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in terms of the misdeeds of the leadership. Paul Wheatley, but also several others, highlighted the unlikelihood that Mark claimed Jesus had, quote unquote, declared all foods clean. He also highlighted the Jewish baptisms in Mark, which are never translated thus into English, obscuring the extent to which the baptism of Mark's own group stood over against, but in relation to, other practices. There was extensive discussion of whether the author's explanation of such things as those indicated a Gentile audience, and hopefully there was a recognition by the end of it all that the presence of some Gentiles and or perhaps even diaspora Jews, however few in number, might require the explanation of Judean customs. Within the context of the discussion of the aforementioned topics, it became clear that as we draw new conclusions about the framework and about individual pericopes, such as the one with making all foods clean, we will ultimately need to revisit all of our past scholarship that has been affected by those prior assumptions in light of the changes that we make and the new conclusions that we draw. Heidrun Mader's presentation led me to reflect on the fact that Christian interpreters have been less willing to embrace Jesus's denigration of non-Jews than they have been of Jesus' Jewishness. How would the New Testament literature look, I found myself wondering, if we asked not which are within Judaism, but which put Jews first and relegate others to a secondary status, and to what extent? Stepping beyond the texts that are our focus here today, and at this conference over these 3 days, since we've regularly made reference to other early Christian works by way of comparison, what might it look like to read Acts 15 and recognize that Gentiles get no say in the terms imposed on them? What might it look like to view the debate not as about inclusivity, so much as about the terms of surrender to be imposed on the peoples subjected to the Jewish God by the Jewish King Jesus? What we call inclusivity is the inviting of all into the exclusivity of the covenant with Abraham. The prospect of Christianity having emerged out of a movement that can be described in terms of Jewish nationalism, even if this conclusion is not ultimately embraced by scholars, will certainly lead us to some interesting discussion about some of the key matters that have brought us together at this conference. Margaret Fröhlich's exploration of the imperial rhetoric of Mark in relation to that of Rome, and Nathaniel Vette's exploration of Jesus' circumambulation of his kingdom by way of the British Midlands connect us with and raise possibilities in connection with these topics I've just been mentioning. Following on from that, I was struck by the thread of Judean/Jewish identity over against Israelite identity and the Abrahamic versus Mosaic covenants that connected both days, even if they were more in focus on Tuesday, as we talked about Paul. I could not help but wonder whether an early focus on other children of Abraham, located in the Roman province of Arabia, which would have included descendants perhaps of Ishmael, but at the very least, descendants of Esau, might not have been a feature of the Jesus movement which Paul opposed, taking aim at the movement's activity in places like Damascus as a result. This in turn might explain Paul's visit to Arabia immediately after embracing the movement that he once opposed. John Van Martin highlighted that it is important to consider Mark within Judaism precisely because it is so easy either to fit Mark neatly within the paradigm or to view Mark as standing over against it as a quote-unquote Pauline gospel. Hebrews is also not included today, but an allusion to it is inevitable since time prevents me from digging in detail into all the rich discussion Sarah Emanuel offered of the terminology of within Judaism itself, the issues raised by Laura Bizzaro about the date and authorship of Mark in relation to the destruction of the temple in the narrative of Mark 13, but also in history in the year 70, as well as the many discussants, each of whom packed an incredibly rich amount of valuable insight into their 5 minutes. I'm eager for us to turn our attention today to Revelation, with its 144,000 from the tribes of Israel, its 24 elders, its synagogue of Satan, its intriguing use of Zechariah's 2 lampstands, that is, 2 anointed ones or messiahs, the kingdoms of this world becoming the kingdoms of the Lion of Judah, its stance on food sacrificed idols, and much, much more. Although we cannot meet again tomorrow to recap today, I'm certain that we will all find ourselves at 1 p.m. today having not only benefited from focused discussion of Revelation, but also noticing threads that ran all the way from Gabriele's opening remarks on day 1 until the conference's conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Yes, and I'm happy you alluded to the letter to the Hebrews. We are planning to have a panel on that in September. So yeah, this conference is a bit like the World Cup qualifiers. This is the World Cup qualifiers, and then the World Cup later this fall. But thank you for that polished, nice summary of what happened yesterday. John, as the chair organizer of yesterday's fantastic panel, I don't know if you have any thoughts you'd like to share about what happened yesterday.
I have a couple, and James had such a nice summary of a lot of the topics of the presentations. I don't want to do that, but as I was reflecting on the session last night while I was trying to sleep, 2 things I think came to mind. The first is among our panelists and discussants, I felt like there were sort of two nodes that their readings were sort of going to. And one being something kind of like the traditional Gentile mark in all its ambiguity, and something being something within Judaism, whatever exactly that means. And so often it seemed like, well, first of all, it seems like a lot of this has to do with the criteria of coherence. Can we create a coherent reading of the story? And on some level, with Mark's gospel, oddly, it to an extent works in different ways. Now, I think there are tensions in one and tensions probably in the other too, but it's interesting to reflect then on how answerable our questions are. If these sort of 2 competing models are at least possible to hold together in your head, but also what this means for the text of Mark itself. And one thing that I've been struck with spending some time in Mark and often comparing it to Matthew because of the people I was in dialogue with, more than Luke, but a little bit too, is that Mark is often not very, to me, a lot of things aren't that thematized or aren't that explicit. And this could be for a variety of reasons. But maybe it's because some of the issues, like in Matthew, where you have this 2-step movement, Gentiles or the disciples aren't supposed to go to the Gentiles or the Samaritans. But then after the resurrection and the ascension, then they are supposed to. And Matthew kind of, at least I think, schematizes this. Mark, I don't think does that. I wonder if some of these questions are things that are happening between the time of Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel, and Matthew just has to make some things a bit more specific. Mark seems sort of ambiguous in some of these ways and allowing for some of these different reconstructions. One thought, my only other thought that I have here is that on the question of definition, which didn't come up a lot yesterday, but it did come up in the Paul section a lot, and we did a lot of it. And what struck me is, however we try to define this, I feel like at a certain point, you have to do that with language in order to talk clearly between ourselves. But eventually we end up with trivialities that aren't ultimately verifiable from the text. In my experience, and then we can't find a line, and we try to go on one side of the line, and so I've done the definition thing, and I'm not convinced that it's reached a good conclusion. But what I do think the Within Judaism label is useful for as an alternative hypothesis, and a number of people have talked about this, to the reading of Mark or the New Testament as Christian texts in sort of a bald way. And so in that sense, then, if we have sort of Mark's gospel being able to be read with a certain degree of coherence in different ways that kind of cluster around a couple different approaches, I feel like to me at least, the Within Judaism reading of Mark is then a necessary corrective to at least sort of show how what has been, let's call it Gentile Mark or whatever, reading of Mark is possible, but also alternatives are, and sort of to kind of loosen that consensus a bit, and sort of re-encounter these texts. So to me, that's the value of the approach. It's simply as like the rhetorical move of saying, rethink the assumption, and then given how much of the scholarship has been on one side, I feel like starting with the opposite hypothesis for a while is a useful way to move forward. Those are my kind of big picture questions, or reflections from the last 2 days.
Thank you, John. Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how what kind of convergent points or distinctive points will emerge with each one of these discrete documents that we're reading from early Christianity, what are overlapping points, and then what are particularities to the documentation in question, which already came up yesterday nicely. There is time here for some of the other panelists from yesterday. If you want to share anything, there's no obligation, but obviously we have the opportunity to have a nice conversation about what happened yesterday as we move forward. Sarah, yes.
Thank you so much. So, and thank you for those brilliant summaries and further questions. There was a part of the conversation that kind of stuck with me throughout the rest of the day yesterday, and I mean a long day. It's 6:45 in the morning for me here, so I was really kind of going back and forth to what we were talking about a lot, and one thing in particular just kept popping up in my mind. And I recognize that I'm trying to open up a very clear consensus within New Testament studies, but I would like to try this again to perhaps see if maybe, just maybe, there might be room to think about this perhaps just a little bit differently. And that consensus is that if a character within the New Testament explains something Jewish, that it must imply that the intended audience, at the very least, includes non-Jews, or perhaps is targeted toward non-Jews. And I'll be clear, I'm not arguing in any way, shape, or form that these texts are written for only Jews. I'm certainly open to the Gospel of Mark or other texts also thinking about non-Jews in mind. However, what I want to problematize is the consensus that if we see something explained, that automatically means it's not for Jews here. And so we know that we don't have access to the common person, which includes the common Jewish person. And yet we're still assuming that we have access to the common Jewish person, and the common Jewish person would know every Jewish referent, including ones that may seem basic to us, but maybe they're not. And so I want to add just a little something to see if maybe this might open things up. And I recognize that this might be a little self-centered. I recognize that it might be fully anachronistic, kind of getting to what John said of, how much are our questions and thoughts shaped by our modern lenses. But I'm just going to throw this out there anyway to see if it might do something. So I am Jewish. I was raised in a very Jewish home. But I was not raised in a theistically oriented Jewish home or a halakhically oriented Jewish home. My mother's from Italy. I was sent to school with prosciutto sandwiches, but was at synagogue multiple times a week also. And if a friend or a colleague who is also Jewish wants to share some kind of idea with other Jews, and it includes something halakhically oriented, even if it seems super basic, they're going to have to explain it to me. Okay, so I'm again, this could be anachronistic, but I don't want us to assume that every Jew knows everything about Jewishness. And I really want to ask us, if we were talking about Christians, would we assume so quickly such sameness? So that's all I want to add about yesterday.
Thanks, right. And even sometimes when I'm Jewish too, we go to Hebrew day school. Sometimes we still need a refresher explanation of what we forgot. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, if anybody wants to talk, you can raise your hand virtually. Gabriele, go ahead.
No, I mean, I like very much the point you just made, and on the other hand, I mean, the most basic elements of Jewish monotheism, Mark does not feel the need to explain them. So it means that the people that I mean, the audience of Mark should have been familiar with this aspect. It remains the problem of who the Iudaioi are. So, and again, I will ask again this question, John. What is the impression about who the Iudaioi are? Are all the Jews as we mean today, or for Mark is a certain category of Jews as the Jews of Judea do? Okay, which could be a good explanation, because not necessarily the practices were the same in Judea or in the diaspora or among the different Jewish groups. And related to this question, there is also another clarification. We have put a lot of emphasis both in the Paul within Judaism session, that in the Mark within Judaism session, about the diversity of Second Temple Judaism, which is an important element in order to argue that Mark and the first Christians were Jewish, even though they have very distinctive views, very distinctive ideas. Nonetheless, they were part of this diverse world of Second Temple Judaism, made of many different groups. But exactly because of this, I think it would be necessary to stress a little bit more, or at least to examine what kind of Jew Mark was. So, because there were many different ways of being Jewish at the time. So, in our analysis of Mark, what is your conclusion? I don't know, that Mark is closer to some, I don't know, some apocalyptic forms of Judaism, or is closer to some Jewish Hellenistic forms of Judaism. Certainly there is evidence, and you point out of a strong opposition against the priestly leadership. Okay, but it remains the point of the the connections of this Jewish author, okay, with other forms of Judaism. Can we see in the Gospel of Mark evidence of this kind of conversation? Can we see a reference to particular Jewish texts of the time? Yesterday, the Psalm of Solomon were mentioned, but I think there are other texts that were very much a part of Mark's background, I mean, of Mark's religious conversation, I mean, from the book of Enoch, the book of the parables of Enoch. I mean, so what is the impression that you got, specialist of Mark, about the place of Mark within the diversity of Jewish groups?
I personally am a bit hesitant of trying to map Mark onto something that already exists, or more than just maybe noting parallel themes or things. Just because I tend to see like the little data that comes to us that is sort of by happenstance transmitted from the past to us, and that we reconstruct Judaism with is so limited, and there's so much that we've just lost. I'm hesitant to try to say it's more like this kind or that kind, because it's probably more like something that's just gone. But I do think that Mark is apocalyptic. I think he's expecting the return of the Son of Man quite soon. He says within a generation, and that seems to be the best way to read it. So that he's among other Jewish persons who are also expecting something like that, maybe also because of the Roman destruction of the temple. That's as much as I'm sort of comfortable saying in terms of positioning it. In terms of the question of who the Judaioi are, I don't know that we can answer that well. The only thing that I have is that and I do note this in my book, all of the references to the Judaioi, throughout the Gospel of Mark, relate to what we would call the Roman province of Judea, south of Samaria. The only exception is the comment in the parenthetical comment we've been talking about, but even there, it's sort of in the context referring specifically to Pharisees and scribes who came from Judea. So that's at least possible, and there is a Galilee-Judea contrast, but I don't know that he uses it specifically in a geographical sense, but it does just occur in those situations. For the parenthetical comment itself, the argument I make in my project, at least, is that all the Jews. I don't focus on the boundaries of Judaioi, but rather on how sort of categorical adjectives are used. All almost never means all. And usually there's some shared assumption between people as they're communicating about all of what. I asked my daughter, "Did you eat all of your peas?" And I'm not asking, or all of the peas. I'm not talking about the ones that are frozen in the freezer, and we know that, but I don't delineate it. So I suspect something like that is going on there.
Yes, thanks for that. Margaret, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that methodologically, I've found it very helpful to start interacting, especially well with post-colonial thought, and also especially with Asian and Asian American interpretation. And you can't obviously make direct cultural comparisons, right, to what's going on, but there's a lot of that language about diaspora and about, minority, majority, and, what it means to be a good member of your ethnic group when you're in these situations of imperialism and, ethnic diversity and those sorts of things. So I think methodologically we can learn a lot from some of this other stuff that's going on. I feel like a lot of times we get ourselves kind of siloed in our little corners of the field.
Thanks for sharing that. For me, it was interesting thinking about yesterday's sessions about some of the salient points that don't really concern the discussion of Paul within Judaism. I mean, one obvious point is the synoptic problem, uh, uh, which I find very curious as to why, thinking of the dating of Mark, which was also something that came up frequently yesterday. If we're thinking that Mark is the earliest gospel, and I haven't yet seen a good argument against Markan priority, even if I remain somewhat agnostic about the synoptic problem. I'm thinking of Mark Elliott's very stimulating response yesterday, but also wondering how is it that Mark, the earliest gospel, presumably, so earlier, maybe it's a bit naive to say closer to Judaism, but there's a point in thinking about this chronologically in relationship to the discussion within Judaism, why Mark has been left out of the conversation within Judaism up until now, or there's been some discussions, but not as much. That's my impression. And how then do we explain the relationship with Matthew and Luke? It just strikes me as odd that Matthew would be appropriating a Gentile gospel and trying to kosherize it, so to speak, make it more Jewish. That's usually how redactional critical analysis has approached the problem of Mark. Why not just go ahead, do your own project? And so, what yesterday's panel brought to my attention and has convinced me more and more is maybe we can start with this premise and see where it goes. Mark is Jewish, and look at the possible ramifications with how we view then the relationship with the other synoptic gospels. So for me, that was one very interesting takeaway. The audience, right? We know the audience for Paul. With the audience of Mark, we have to make some educated guesses. So there's a little difference there. And then the trial scenes, I just want to, bring that to the forefront to try to connect the dots with the Paul within Judaism session as we're thinking about the ethical implications of our research. Maybe Mark has less controversial passages than some of the other New Testament literature, but we still do have the trial scene. And I'm thinking of that in relation to 1 Thessalonians 2, 14 to 16, which was brought up on the first day, how we handle those texts and how also the canonicity of these texts may be affecting how we approach these when we're talking about whatever text within Judaism. So those are just some thoughts from my point of view. We can maybe field another question or comment here before we start transitioning officially to revelation within Judaism proper.
Isaac, if nobody is intervening, I would like to add one more thing. I think what struck me very much is that comparing the Paul within Judaism section and the Mark within Judaism section, how the Paul read within Judaism looks very, very close to the Mark within Judaism. So, because usually, traditionally, I mean, we tend to make a strong difference between Paul and Mark. Okay, Paul and the synoptic tradition. I mean, Paul was considered something less Jewish, okay, in general. And I think that instead, the more we study these authors within Judaism, the more similar, or at least the more points in common they have. And a second thing that I learned that we should abandon completely this language of a text that is more or less Jewish, because really does not make any sense in my view. How can you say that the text is more or less Jewish? We can say that the text represents different views of Judaism, but if we say that it's more or less, we are assuming that there is a sort of normative form of Judaism, and we are comparing a text, measuring this text with a normative view of Judaism. So my strong recommendation after these first 2 days of conference would be to completely abandon this language of text being more or less Jewish. Even in the relation between Mark and Matthew, it's not the fact one is more Jewish or less Jewish. We have to think in different ways. They represent a different understanding of Judaism. None of them is neither is more or less. Okay, these are all Jewish texts, but of course they may be different because Judaism at the time was more monolithic. So there were the same when we talk about Paul and James. It's not that one is more Jewish and one is less Jewish. I mean, this kind of language should be completely abandoned.
Thanks for that. And I hope we can come back maybe in the second half of today's Revelation panel, touch on some lingering questions, remaining points here vis-a-vis maybe Mark and Paul in connection with Revelation. But I'm going to hereby transition to the session on Revelation within Judaism. We're also making history here as well with the Enoch seminar. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that we have a panel, an event dedicated exclusively to the book of Revelation within Judaism. For those who have looked at previous forms of the schedule, unfortunately, John Marshall and Daniel Smith are not able to join us. So if you're wondering about that, there were some personal matters that came up last minute. So we are going to go in the order that is in the updated schedule. Since we have a slightly smaller panel today than on the first day and the second day, our panelists have a little more time if they want to. You were given instructions 10-minute limit, but if you want to go over a bit, a couple of minutes, not 1 hour, you may do so. So there's some flexibility here with the time. We will, once all of the panelists for the Revelation session today have given a presentation, we're going to take a little break as we have done during the previous days, and then we will come back together and schmooze and converse and have a good, meaningful discussion. So without further ado here, I'm going to welcome Ralph Corner to the virtual platform. You are first on the list. Ralph, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Isaac. I was going to share screen to get my PowerPoint going. Yeah, I trust we're seeing the full set of slides. Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm grateful for the privilege of participating in the session on Revelation and look very forward to learning much from my fellow panelists and from you, the participants, in the ensuing discussion. Much of what I'll be sharing today derives from my book, Reading Revelation After Supersessionism. The two primary questions that I'll explore relative to the book of Revelation that we are looking at in these last 3 days is one, what are the criteria for determining that a text is or is not within Judaism? And what changes when a text is read within Judaism? I'll explore these two questions through 4 interpretive frameworks that scholarship has used in assessing Jewish apocalyptic writings. These 4 heuristic categories are, first, what literary features are consistent with the genre designation apocalypse? Second, what types of imagery are associated with apocalyptic writings? Third, what types of eschatology are associated with apocalyptic writings? And 4, what is the social function or apocalypticism of the religio-political movement that created an apocalyptic text? Reading Revelation through this 4-fold interpretive grid facilitates greater clarity relative to Revelation's intersections with Judaismos. Here I follow Boyarin and Nanos in their translation of Judaismos as Jewishness, that is, Jewish practice, belief, and self-definition. Okay, find my slide. There we go. Apocalypse. John's use of apocalyptic literary conventions is the first interpretive framework for assessing Revelation's intersections with Judaismus. In 1979, John Collins, as chair of the Apocalypse group of the SBL Genre Project, published their findings on literary conventions that are found within Jewish apocalypses. In 1997, David Aouni demonstrated that Revelation intersects all 13 categories of the genre Jewish apocalypse. And I apologize for the squishy look of this chart, but at the far right, you can see Revelation has X's pretty well all the way down on the far right side for all 13 of those categories. Visionary literary conventions also demonstrate Revelation's intersections with the Jewish apocalyptic and Hebrew prophetic literature. John uses two Greek clauses to create a reiterative structure. These two clauses are metatauta adon and kai-adon. John's reiterative structure allows one to view chapters 7 to 22 as expansive revisitations of the same, quote, time frame, unquote, of the eschaton that is first concisely described in the sixth seal, which is found in chapter 6, verses 12 to 17, and which describes in condensed Reader's Digest version the great day of the wrath of the Lamb and of God. As a result, John's 7 ecclesia associations in Roman Asia could very well have concluded that they were either on the cusp of the eschaton or actually already in the eschaton, particularly if seals 1 to 5 simply reflected historical realities that had already been happening prior to John's writing the Revelation, or even during that time frame. War, famine, plagues, wild animals, that kind of thing. This implicitly reinforces the explicit references to the imminent return of Yeshua, the Christos, thereby adding additional encouragement towards faithful living in light of the perceived impending demise of the Roman Imperium. Epistolary literary conventions suggest that Revelation coheres with a Jewish epistolary subgenre that Donald Versaput calls covenantal letter to the diaspora. He identifies 5 extant texts of this subgenre. I forwarded chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, which contain the letters to John's 7 ecclesia associations, as a 6th example. Apocalyptic imagery. John's use of apocalyptic imagery is a second interpretive framework for assessing Revelation's intersections with Judaismus. John's incorporation of symbolism, consonant with Jewish circles of his day, includes elements such as numerology, that is the numbers 6 and 7, gematria, the 666, tropes, and topoi. One example of an apocalyptic trope is John's expression, quote, a complete number, unquote, of individuals. Some examples of apocalyptic topoi, or stock images, include judgment being equated with a book, the image of a restored Jerusalem, and an earthquake as a judgment motif. And the earthquake, the great earthquake in Revelation, becomes one of John's key organizing principles for the revolving, repetitive, reiterative revisitations of judgment through the seals, trumpets, and bowls. Apocalyptic eschatology. John's use of apocalyptic eschatology is a third interpretive framework for assessing Revelation's intersections with Judaismus. In an inner biblical twist, Revelation identifies the people of God as actually becoming the place of God. 4th Ezra 7 looks forward to the revelation from heaven of, quote, the city, unquote, and of, quote, the land, unquote, in the eschaton. This reference to a hidden land that will be revealed is unique in Jewish Second Temple literature. Robert Gundry has highlighted, however, that John's New Jerusalem is not primarily depicted as a people, that is, a place for people, but rather that the New Jerusalem is symbolic of a people who eternally are a place. Why does he say this? In chapter 21, verses 9 and 10, John's interpreting angel tells him that he will show him, quote, the bride, the wife of the Lamb. John would have expected to revisit chapter 7, where he saw the great multitude in heaven worshiping the Lamb. But instead, what John actually sees is the New Jerusalem, which descends from the sky. And I say sky here because the Greek word uranos can be translated sky, not always heaven. Given that the New Jerusalem is symbolic of the people of God, would it also include genealogical Judaioi who do not follow Yeshua? The walls of the New Jerusalem are depicted as having 12 gates and as sitting upon a 12-fold foundation. The 12-fold foundation, which represents the 12 apostles of the Lamb, functions as a synecdoche for all Yeshua followers, whether Judaioi or non-Judaioi. Thus, the 12-fold foundation represents what I would call the universal ecclesia, or if you will, anachronistically, the universal church. Given that the 12-fold foundation represents multi-ethnic Christos followers, then to whom or to what do the 12 gates refer? Each of the 12 gates are said to be inscribed with the names of, quote, the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel in Revelation 21. This phrase only occurs one other time in John's apocalypse. In chapter 7, John refers to the 144,000 as being sealed out of, quote, every tribe of the sons of Israel, unquote. The logical conclusion then is that the 12 gates are representative of the 144,000. I contend that the 12 gates and the 144,000 do not symbolize the church universal. Rather, I suggest that the 144,000 depict the final cohort of the saved remnant of genealogical Judaioi who have existed ever since Abraham's time, who have a faith like Abraham's, yet who right up until the parousia do not follow Yeshua as their Christos. This is not dissimilar to Fitzmyer's contribution to the eschatological miracle perspective on Paul's all Israel be saved, where he suggests something similar, but he does not use the term Abrahamic faith. What is the upside of this Abrahamic faith eschatology, so to speak? It is that ultimate or eschatological salvation is guaranteed at death for genealogical Judaioi who, quote, follow in the footsteps of Abraham, unquote, if I might use Paul's terminology in Romans 4:12 here, but yet who do not follow Yeshua as a Jewish Christos. What is the downside? One could suggest that my view on the 144,000 reflects eschatological supersessionism. This is because I contend that when the symbolic 144,000, or Abrahamic faith Judaioi, enter heaven at death, it will only be at that time that they will discover that Yeshua's sacrificial death and resurrection has provided the forensic basis for their entrance into heaven, if I might use that term. Christos follows, on the other hand, have their future eschatological salvation already inaugurated during their lifetimes, not just when they wake up on the other side of eternity. Perhaps the moniker soft eschatological supersessionism is more appropriate, since, one, my view on the 144,000 removes the necessity of a conscious commitment to Yeshua as a prerequisite for entrance into heaven at death, and since, two, Judaismos is implicitly affirmed in perpetuity through the symbolic identification only of genealogical Judaioi with the 12 gates. Apocalypticism. John's brand of apocalypticism is a fourth interpretive framework for assessing Revelation's intersections with Judaismos. The social functioning of Revelation for John's ecclesia associations has at least two trajectories: Jewish communities and the Roman Imperium. I will not explore Revelation's counter-imperial rhetoric here, except to note that John sought, quote, to overcome the intolerable tension between reality and hopeful faith, unquote, as Adela Yarbrough Collins so helpfully framed things, by encouraging his Christus followers towards living faithfully, given the fact that God's justice will triumph in the end. There are two passages in Revelation that seem ironically to denigrate the Judaismos of Judaioi, not least in Smyrna and Philadelphia. These two passages talk about those who say they are Jews and are not, and who are part of the synagogue of Satan. There are at least 8 interpretive approaches, with only one being supersessionist. The other 7 views either see John's comments, 1, as reflecting an intramural conversation between sects within Judaismos, or some suggest it's extramural. That is, though, between Yeshua following Messianics and Judaioi who do not follow Yeshua. Or two, as reflecting an intramural Yeshua follower conversation on Torah observance between John's ecclesiae, Neo-Pauline ecclesiae, and or non-Pauline synagogae. In sum, I've read Revelation within Judaismos by using not just a bifocal lens or even trifocals, but rather a quadfocal lens, so to speak, which I might call the, quote, progressive lens, unquote, of the four interpretive frameworks that scholarship uses in assessing Jewish apocalyptic writings. I trust that reading Revelation through this fourfold interpretive grid facilitates greater clarity and precision for any conclusions reached relative to Revelation's intersections with Judaismos, that is, with Jewish practices, beliefs, and self-definitions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph. I'm very happy that you addressed the issue of supersessionism. It's one of the main points that is identified in the volume edited by Bird, Bühner, Frey, and Rosner on the Paul within Judaism Schule, so to speak. Supersessionism being one of these concerns or matters therein. We're going to proceed next with Kelly Colvins-Bouch, one of the vice directors of the Enoch seminar. Kelly, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Isaac has let us know that we can respond from any particular area of our research or offer comments of a more general nature, and I'll do the latter. With regard to why one might consider the Book of Revelation within Judaism, I think there are many good reasons. That appears to be what John of Patmos is doing, revealing information that would be otherwise inaccessible or conveying an apocalypsos from a position deeply informed by Judaism. Much of the imagery, the motifs, and symbolic universe in Revelation is familiar from the literature of ancient Israel. John and the communities in John's spheres of influence use for themselves the title of Jew and perceive themselves as part of the people of God who will inhabit a new Jerusalem. Others have noted how Revelation may reflect traditions found in Ezekiel, literature associated with Enoch, and Daniel chapter 7 through 12, works that might be described as visionary, featuring extraordinary and extravagant imagery. The Exodus account, images from prophetic literature, like Isaiah, cultic worship associated with the temple, Revelation samples them all. Isaac asked, what are the criteria for determining that Revelation is or is not within Judaism? By way of a response, I would in turn ask, would our 21st century definitions of Judaism or construct be helpful in responding to that question? I don't know. Does Revelation claim to be Jewish? I think the book of Revelation, or better, John of Patmos does. Not only do I think that John claims this identity, I think John guards this identity. David Frankfurter, who's here with us, has noted how Revelation's attention to issues involving food and sexual purity play a role in defining John's communities. At the same time, we see how John takes on those with whom he disagrees. For example, in chapter 2, he caricatures those who have lax approaches to food or are courting polytheism as Jezebel, Balaam, and Balak, all non-Israelites. Balaam especially is associated with prophecy and divining, just as Revelation's Jezebel is associated here with prophecy. Of course, we want the fuller backstory on the woman prophet and the Nicolaitans, but we know that John wants to differentiate his communities from leaders he considers polytheists and or non-Israelites. Thus, because John understands his testimony, prophecy, or apocalypsos through the lens of Judaism, I see that as a good reason for reading Revelation within Judaism. That doesn't mean One shouldn't try to examine Revelation through other prisms or with attention to other matrices. Isaac also asked us to think about what changes when we read Revelation within Judaism. Acquainting oneself with the plethora of Jewish traditions from the first centuries BCE and CE helps to make clear how Revelation can be understood within diverse Jewish frameworks. I think Gabriele alluded to this in his opening comments. When one is familiar with other contemporaneous visionary works, and those involving some sort of journey or ascent and developed angelology that we would designate as Jewish text, think, for example, of the Book of the Watchers, Revelation seems to have some kinship. If one considers the different sorts of mediatorial roles from preeminent angelic figures like Michael to Logos and Philo, to the elevation of a David as a messianic figure, or transformation, excuse me, or transformation of Enoch. Sorry, I've got to get a sip of water. Apologies. I'm going to start over. If one considers the different sorts of mediatorial roles from the preeminent angelic figures like Michael to Logos and Philo, to the elevation of a David, a messianic figure, or transformation of Enoch, or the self-glorification hymn, the messianism of Revelation is not quite so odd within the realm of possibilities for ancient Judaism. Literarily, Revelation is profitably read with 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch, and the parables of Enoch. In the hot off the presses, most recent issue of Journal for the Study of Pseudepigrapha, 34.4, John Deek has a fantastic article on God's people and visions and letters, and he's especially interested in reading both 2nd Baruch and Revelation as epistolary apocalypses. And I appreciate also Ralph's calling our attention to genre issues. There's plenty to suggest that Revelation is at home among other first century works that inhabit a kind of in-between space that is between worlds and cultural spheres of influence. I'm interested also in Revelation as visionary literature of the diaspora that also looks to territory much like the animal apocalypse and the apocalypse of weeks. A descending utopia is imagined, invoking the 12 tribes and community as a spiritual home. And the eschatological nature of Revelation is also illumined by the war scroll in 2nd Baruch. Ralph has done a great job in addressing very briefly the challenges in interpreting Revelation chapter 2, verse 9, and chapter 3, verse 9. Selections that speak of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of a synagogue of Satan. I find most plausible those interpretations that read these verses as John speaking from within Judaism. And I think that really helps to respond now to the question that Isaac posed to us. So I'm going to stop there. I have a feeling that maybe our comments will overlap with one another, and I think Ralph has covered some of the ground I would, but I would say in sum that there's much to be gained by reading Revelation as a Jewish text. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. We're going to proceed next with David Frankfurter.
Okay. Let's see, unmute. Right. Good. So my 2 articles on Revelation in HTR over many years have been developing a picture of John of Patmos as resisting the hegemony of Pauline influence as it had developed in late 1st century Asia Minor. John sees a complex of defiling teachings purveyed by prophets of his time, idolathuta, non-kosher food, porneia, improper end-time sexuality, and plainly non-Jews calling themselves Judaioi. All of these teachings could be traced to Paul, whether as misinterpretations or not. Against this 3rd generation Paulinism, then, John maintains a position as Jewish, as against the so-called Jews, advocates celibacy for the eschatological saintly body, against Paul's permission for marital sex, and clearly does not allow the breaching of kashrut, against Paul's allowance for idolathuta. His literary frame of reference is Jewish traditions of revealing heavenly visions, as in Ezekiel and Enoch. His nightmarish visions of the end times emphasize the disgust of sexual fluids, the chalice held by the porne in chapter 17, and forced idol worship, chapter 13. Further, he elevates the commandments of the Torah and repudiates the polluting forces of the outside, those beyond the wall. And he depicts the perfect heavenly saints, the 144,000 according to the 12 tribes of Israel. He has no great interest in the fate of the nations in the eschaton, except to note, as Elaine Pagels has argued, that the ethne and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into the city as a sort of devotional gift from outsiders. Overall, the text seems Jewish through and through, a sort of new Ezekiel. What it's doing in the New Testament is a complicated issue. From the micropolitics of 3rd century Alexandria, when revelation was almost excluded, to modern times when the text excites Christian Zionists and unsettles liberal Christians. But as Jewish as these details make it, I don't want to say it's completely anomalous to a collection of writings later designated Christian, since Jesus is mentioned several times and many of the psychedelic figures John sees in heaven clearly incorporate the risen Messianic Christ. The question is really what the inclusion of Christ images means for the modern historical classification of a text, alongside, say, the Ascension of Isaiah, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, 2nd and 3rd Baruch, and so on, rather than the familiar canon of the New Testament. I might extend this question of historical classification to ask, to what degree does a text composed within a Jewish framework suggest an alternative sectarian self-definition outside Judaism? As Paula Fredrickson remarked some years ago, any ancient community that relies on the Septuagint to construct its ideas, ethics, eschatology, and Christology is ipso facto Jewish. To me, her point is definitive. But can a text be seen as moving into a separate sectarian domain from, as opposed to within, Judaism? I think that can be debated with Johannine texts, Luke Acts, and many apocryphal apocryphal acts. But in the case of Revelation, the answer is absolutely not. Indeed, it doubles down on halakhic purity, articulating a priestly purity reminiscent of the Qumran War Scroll. In my remaining minutes, I want to touch on a feature of Revelation that many would call intrinsically Christian as opposed to Jewish. That is, the many figures John sees in heaven and on Patmos, most of whom seem to have some connection to Jesus. The giant Son of Man in chapter 1 declares, "I was dead, and see, I am alive forever." The seven-eyed lamb stands as if it had been slaughtered. The mounted warrior of chapter 19 has a blood-stained robe. In contrast to the multiple divine figures and hypostases in other Jewish apocalypses, these Christological details would seem to add up to a pretty Christian heaven. And yet each one of these figures is first and foremost a clever reimagination of the Lord Angel, that figure in Jewish apocalyptic literature who migrates between enthronement, vengeance, the divine name itself, and revelation to the righteous. We know the Lord Angel from Daniel 7, similitudes of Enoch, and many other texts. It's been written about and defined by Christopher Rowland, Jarl Fossum, and Guy Strumsa, among others. The Lord angel and his forms are the means by which God makes himself known to righteous visionaries. This is the revelation that John is offering, this panoply of divine forms. So what then do we do with the Jesus details? In simple terms, they suggest that the Lord angel has incorporated Jesus, even while still being the Lord angel. He is no different in that capacity. There is nothing Christian in the Lord angel's vengeance, enthronement, or revelation among the lampstands. The Jesus details augment and identify him without changing his heavenly functions according to Jewish apocalyptic tradition. But does identifying the Lord angel as the risen Christ signify an historical sectarian shift from Judaism to another religion? I would argue no. The frames of reference have not changed, only a detail has been added. The bodily ethics, purity boundaries, and devotion to Torah remain. The visions themselves are largely inspired from John's deep contemplation of Ezekiel. People might object. If John sees Christ in heaven, then why wouldn't we say the text is Christian? But again, I would insist, it is not Christ per se he sees in heaven, but the Lord angel who has incorporated Christ. And in the end, when the Lamb presides over the heavenly city alongside the kavod of God, there is nothing Jesus-y about the Lamb's role. He is simply the regent of God. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that. And maybe with Revelation of John, we might have an easier time, or perhaps not, answering Gabriele Boccaccini's question during the panel. Within which kind of Judaism might this book, be fitted into? I'm wondering whether sectarian, apocalyptic, those monikers might be of use. But we're going to move on. Next in line is Rebecca Hay.
All right. Let's share my screen here. Okay. So Revelation should be interpreted within Judaism because it's a text that seems to be written by a Jewish author for an intended audience he considers true a Judaioi and Israelites, as has been discussed. John wrote Revelation in the 1st century CE before the Jesus movement had a conception of itself as outside of Judaism. Even if John knew the word Christian, he avoids it. And his apocalypse reflects Second Temple nationalist expectations. It's a story about an imminent eschatological holy war to liberate the nation of Israel from foreign oppression in battles that take place on Jewish land, led by a figure John believes to be the Jewish Messiah. Finally, as both John's epistolatory prologue and his apocalypse illustrate, he seeks to clarify the boundaries between insiders to God's people and outsiders. For him, those who are ritually qualified to participate in this last battle, and those whose lack of sanctity puts them and their community at risk. Reading Revelation within Judaism might mean excising supersessionist readings, but it also means grappling with newfound textual stickiness, questioning readings that assume John is doing something radically Christian as opposed to Second Temple Jew-ish. It means decentering John's supposed interest in universal salvation and grappling with the ethnic particularities of John's vision of the end. In my current book project, I contend that reading Revelation within Judaism, and I compare it to the War Scroll to make that case, means setting aside models that treat the violence in Revelation as purely cathartic or imaginative. And I argue that not reading Revelation within Judaism fundamentally limits our interpretive horizons for this text. So for this talk, I will offer one case study in how new interpretive possibilities can emerge when we read Revelation within Judaism. In Revelation 14, 1-5, John describes the Messiah's army of 144,000 warriors conscripted from the 12 tribes of Israel, standing on Mount Zion. These are the same sons of Israel from Revelation 7, not the ethne from the nations that appear later in that chapter. These Bnei Israel have not defiled themselves with women, as David discussed. This is sexual purity language, which is key before battle to be sexually pure and fight alongside the divine. And this evokes ritual purity laws of Deuteronomy and, again, the Qumran War Scroll. The idea being that when God fights in its midst, the army of Israel must be holy. So war here is a ritualized activity. However, John extends and amplifies the requirements for militant purity. John reveals that these warriors were conscripted not just because they have avoided ritual impurity through sexual contact with women, but also because in their mouths no lie, pseudos, was found, for they are blameless. The Torah uses mumos, blameless, or mum in Hebrew, to refer to blemishes that disqualify priests from serving in God's tabernacle. John understands his idealized army in cultic terms. Another contemporaneous Jewish sect, the Qumran sectarians, also transposed the ritual purity requirements of the physical temple to their community. Just as one needed to immerse before eating sacrificial foods or offering sacrifices in the temple, sect members purified themselves before eating their shared meals. As Hannah Harrington points out, outsiders from the Qumran sect were excluded from their holy house based on impurity, just as they would have been excluded from the temple. So, John is not the first Second Temple author to intensify and extend cultic purity requirements to distinguish those he considers true Israelites from those he does not. John sounds like another Second Temple Jew. When read within Christianity, John's reference to the mouths and to lying is sometimes understood as a Christianization, transforming the physical, ritual nature of impurity with real bodies into a general prohibition against sin. But as the Qumran scrolls illustrate, the idea that false speech could be a source of impurity and is not a moralizing twist on a Jewish ritual concept. So in Leviticus 6, I think 1 through 7, lying is understood as undermining the holiness of Israel and bringing impurity into the community. And according to the Qumran community rule, those who lie about money are excluded from the pure meals of the general membership for a year. Likewise, those who knowingly lie are excluded from the community. So for these sectarians waiting to defeat Belial and the Romans in Holy War, impurity caused by sex and impurity caused by improper speech could both threaten the holiness and sanctity of their redefined Israel. There are several plausible contenders for the deceit or the lying that John targets in Revelation 14:5. Perhaps he is referring to blasphemy, or worshiping Satan and the beast, or perhaps ceasing to witness about the identity of the Messiah. Certainly all these acts might involve speech. I propose another possibility. Perhaps John is worried about people who falsely claim to be members of Israel and who, by implication, threaten the sanctity of the Messiah's holy army and perhaps even the ecclesia's place in the heavenly temple. So the noun pseudos only appears twice more in Revelation, once in 21:27 and 22:15. Both passages speak of a category of persons disqualified from entering the eschatological temple city. Speaking of the nations and foreign kings who come to pay homage, Revelation 21:27 says that nothing unclean, koinon, will enter it, nor anyone who practices abomination or falsehood, pseudos. While the falsehood in question is not specified, John links pseudos with the actions of foreigners who are seemingly barred from access to the sacred city because they belong to the profane. Now, the verb pseudo appears only once in our apocalypse, in John's letter to the assembly in Philadelphia, a passage we've already discussed in this panel and I'm sure will come up again in discussion. This passage might be our smoking gun. So Revelation 3:9 reads, "I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but are lying. I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you." as David Frankfurter, Elaine Pagels, John Marshall have argued, who are core members of the Princeton School of Revelation within Judaism, have argued John of Patmos is addressing members of the Jewish Jesus movement. So taking this verse at face value, there were first-century followers of Jesus in Asia Minor claiming, falsely in John's opinion, to be a Judaioi. As Second Maccabees, Jubilees, and Josephus illustrate, there was a deeply rooted Second Temple tradition of viewing outsiders, like Gentiles, as potential sources of impurity. So given the Apostle Paul's history in the region, as David just mentioned, John could be attacking Gentile followers of Jesus, false Jews, either because they are not ethnically Jewish or perhaps because they do not properly keep the Torah, avoiding things like impurity through sexual morality and food sacrificed to idols. This could also be an inter-Jewish debate. But whatever the case may be, ritual purity is key for John in defining who is and isn't Israel, and key to a successful holy war. So Revelation is still often read as envisioning a universalistic church that lacks distinctions based on ethnicity and ritual purity. But if we read John's Apocalypse alongside other Second Temple texts, he emerges as a Second Temple Jew, concerned with sharpening existing ideas about ritual purity to draw firmer boundaries around his ideal of Israel. So take Revelation 14, 1 through 5. John may be reworking the idea that speech itself can make a person impure, this time targeting those within the Jesus movement who falsely claim to be a Judaioi. In John's view, they pose a threat to the sanctity of the Messiah's army of Israel. This is an example of how, instead of flattening distinctions to form a broad, more inclusive church, John is using Second Temple purity discourses to do the opposite, to establish a hierarchy and reinforce sectarian boundaries. So, in brief, reading Revelation within Judaism for me can open up interpretive possibilities for well-trodden passages and new interlocutors for understanding the social and ritual dynamics of John's Apocalypse. It also helps us create a fuller picture of diasporic Judaism after the fall of the temple and beyond the rabbis, how diasporic Jewish communities were thinking about the temple, assimilation, ritual, and of course, above all, what it might mean to be Jewish. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're going to move on to our next participant, Sarah Emanuel.
Thank you for having me again today. It remains a pleasure to be here. What I'm about to share is a continuation of and more detailed view to some of the questions and concerns I raised yesterday. As Kelly shared, we were invited to think broadly, and my entryway today is indeed broad, and in that sense, a bit different from my fellow speakers. As some may know, it is my contention that the book of Revelation is best read contextually as a Jewish text. I demonstrate this at length in my first book, Humor, Resistance, and Jewish Cultural Persistence in the Book of Revelation, Roasting Rome, published with Cambridge University Press in 2020, in 3 key moves. First, with a historical critical lens, I show how Revelation's repeated appeal to Jewish ethnic practices and its focus on Jesus as the Christ bespeaks a Jewish Christ-following author addressing an implied audience of Jewish Christ followers. I see his implied audience, in fact, as quite narrow. Much of my ideas resemble those that Rebecca shared. She and I are along similar lines of thinking. Not even the infamous anti-Jewish interpretations of Revelation 2:9 and 3:9 persuade me from this reading. When John writes, for example, and as we've seen, I know the slander on the part of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are synagogues of Satan. I see this as a marker of the author's irritation toward non-Jews, those who say they are Jews, but for John at least, are not, or are not the right kind of Jew. These verses, put simply, are just another example of the differences and debates happening within Judaism or within Jewish conversations in the ancient world, including Jew with other Jews or Jewish thinking with Gentiles. Second, by implementing humor theory, I show how John implements elements of humor as a Jewish cultural survival strategy. by characterizing his enemy, the non-Jewish, non-Christ following Rome, responsible for the subalternity of his Jewish counterparts, as a great whore who has had too much to drink. John lampoons or roasts the empire, leaving implied audiences to reign supreme. My third point, however, is that in satirizing Rome, so much so that we see the construction of new subaltern bodies through the text's satiric reimagining, John mirrors the enemy, which counters his ostensible authorial intentions and carries the risk of turning the joke both on him and his apocalypse. My contribution today, however, is not about how or why I read Revelation as a Jewish text, but rather about the aforementioned words, within Judaism. To my mind, the now hotly utilized phrase within Judaism is not simply about reading New Testament texts with Jewishness in mind, as I do in the book summarized above. It is a scholarly framework, one that has a particular history and a particular set of implications that require recognition. Due to time constraints, I will unpack this history briefly. The Within Judaism framework was pioneered by scholars such as Mark Nanos and Magna Zetterholm from within Pauline scholarship as a pushback to what is now commonly referred to as the Old and New perspectives on Paul. The story supporting the old perspective goes something like this. In the mid-1st century CE, there lived a Jewish man named Saul who antagonized followers of Christ. On his way to a synagogue in Damascus, however, he had a vision of Jesus as a resurrected Messiah. Through this experience, Saul realized that Christ followers were right. Jesus was indeed the Messiah. He also realized that Jewishness was marked by unattainable law codes. Humans needed grace through Jesus, not law, in order to attain salvation. Saul thus converted to Christianity and deemed Jewishness, most especially its halakhic traditions, late, as in dead. He also changed his name from the Jewish Saul to the Roman Paul to signify his new convictions. In sum, Judaism, through Jesus, and later supported by Saul/Paul, became a sterile and overbearing tradition of works, while Christianity became the grace-filled tradition of love. Jews who do not rid themselves of their ethnic ties to Judaism and convert to a non-ethnocentric Christianity would be left out of this love and in turn be left out of the end of days. This, in a nutshell, is the old perspective on Paul. In a post-Dead Sea Scrolls, post-Shoah world, New Testament scholars N.T. Wright and the now late James Dunn used the terminology new perspective to refer to an ostensibly new orientation towards Paul and Jews. Their overarching thesis is as follows. Because Israel's theology was always about grace, Paul could not be countering Israel or Judaism via a works versus grace framework. They also suggested that faith in Jesus, a Jew, was part of a Jewish orientation and therefore part of Judaism. To receive everlasting grace through faith in and of Jesus served as a continuation of grace received in and of Abraham. Dunn and Wright did, however, take issue with Jewish ethnocentrism. On their reading, Jews of the 1st century continued to celebrate an exceptional and ethnically bound relationship with God, which makes them fail to grasp the universality of God's grace. According to them, Paul urged Jews to see that their God was not ethnocentric, that their God was not particular to or special for just Jews, and to realize that God's grace was for everyone. Grace, not race, was Wright's overall synopsis. Paul's universalist theology, these scholars made clear, is what made Paul good. From this vantage point, the traditional new perspective does position Paul within a Jewish context, sort of, but it also reads Paul as not just a good Jew, but the good Jew, second perhaps to only Jesus, whereas other Jews, most Jews, remain less than. Biblical scholar James Crossley has linked this perspective to a contemporaneous cultural shift, the anti-racist and multicultural consciousness of postmodernity. Emerging in the latter half of the 20th century, postmodernity describes a period characterized by the rejection of universal truth claims in favor of diversity, plurality, and the acknowledgement of multiple perspectives. Scholars observe, however, that beneath the facade of liberal inclusiveness, racism and discrimination persist. Leaning on the insights of cultural theorists, Crossley writes, quote, liberal Western multicultural inclusiveness is typically an acceptance of the other without the otherness, end quote. Reminiscent of Jordan Peele's 2017 social horror Get Out, Crossley highlights how philo-Semitism is often blurred with anti-Semitism. Just as the rich white characters in Get Out seek to literally inhabit Black bodies while maintaining their white minds, thus showing a simultaneous fetishization and repulsion of Blackness, many thinkers in the Western postmodern era seek to engage the Jew on non-Jewish terms, which some might say sounds a bit like the new perspective on Paul. Indeed, many scholars shaped by an American post-war consciousness found Dunn's and Wright's work to maintain old perspective undertones. In their view, the new perspective's remaining supersessionist claim that Paul is still reaching towards something better than what his Jewish contemporaries could understand makes the Dunn-Wright model, and excuse the pun, not done right. From this pushback was born what scholars have called the radical new perspective on Paul, or now more frequently called the Paul within Judaism approach. This approach agrees that Paul was Jewish, but also often focuses on the fact that Paul was not speaking to fellow Jews, but rather to Gentiles. Paul, this approach tends to belabor, was saying whatever necessary, including belittling Jewish law, in order to persuade Gentiles to stay Gentile, i.e., to not follow Jewish law, as following such would make them Jewish, perhaps even in an attempt to fulfill the common Jewish messianic hope that both Jews and Gentiles would worship the God of Israel together in the end of days. Paul, in short, was not trying to dismantle Judaism. He was simply trying to stop Gentiles from converting to Judaism. Of course, much more can be said of each of these schools, including how each of their logics can be deconstructed. The point here is simply to show from where and how the within Judaism framework emerged. To my mind, it is not simply a framework insisting we consider the Jewishness of the New Testament. It is one that implies the existence of other established scholarly frameworks. In fact, as Adele Reinhardt has recently argued, we do not even need a within Judaism framework to do the work of situating the New Testament within ancient Jewish contexts. To study both the Jewishness of the New Testament and the relationship between Jews and the New Testament, she asserts, does not require this specific and what she sees as flattening category of signification, flattening in the sense that it can oversimplify the New Testament and even bifurcate Jewishness from other classifications. I have pushbacks to the within Judaism movement too, at least when it comes to reading non-Pauline New Testament texts, including especially the book of Revelation. In brief, while a within Judaism approach in Paul studies responds to categories already set in Paul studies, i.e. the old and new perspective, these categories do not exist in other areas of New Testament studies. In short, I think a within Judaism approach is useful when it can help counter other frameworks or categories. To add a within Judaism approach to non-Pauline texts, however, could create frameworks that are not needed. It could, in fact, even backfire by creating more concrete conceptual structures for without Judaism readings, akin to the old and new perspectives. Categories, as I shared yesterday, tend to exist in relation to other categories. What kinds of categories might come into play if we bring this Pauline within Judaism framework to Revelation or other non-Pauline sources? Beyond this, is it possible to become so intellectually constricted by our focus on within Judaism that we flatten and or fetishize the ancient Jewish experience? Might it even lead to us missing when New Testament texts are, in fact, anti-Jewish? Or even more complicated, could we miss when readings for Judaism support anti-Judaism? Wasn't it Bauer who read Revelation as Jewish and therefore saw it as a problem? Or is it only the readings that counter the anti-Jewish ones and thus make us feel good in a post-Shoah world that are given weight within this new within Judaism model? Perhaps alternatively still, maybe it is time our field has a real hard look in the mirror and asks itself why there is such an urge now to utilize within Judaism, when the simple matter of fact is that a major context of the sources it studies has always been Judaism. Why must we need within Judaism to both know and show this? I certainly have my suspicions, but I am eager to hear what others have to say. In sum, if reading Revelation as a Jewish text does not require a within Judaism framework, I didn't use it in Roasting Rome, John Marshall didn't use it in Parables of War, David Frankfurter didn't use it in his Jewish annotated Jewish annotated New Testament notes or articles on Revelation in HTR, then why add a classification that could, in effect, constrict our views or even maybe solidify non-Jewish or even anti-Jewish conceptual approaches to the apocalypse? Revelation is already too often read as a Christian text without nuance or clarification. I'd rather not give any more weight to the arguments that declare it not only non-Jewish, but for some, like many proponents of the old and new perspectives on Paul, or like those who recently hung a banner over the Los Angeles 405 declaring Kanye was right while citing Revelation, rightfully anti-Jewish. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Very insightful, stimulating presentation, which I'm happy we have somebody here stirring some reflection because I was starting to fear it was going to be too easy to talk about Revelation within Judaism. So we'll have some time to discuss these matters. We move to Leslie Baines.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I thought I had someone else coming before me. So give me just a moment here. All right. It seems natural for us 21st century biblical scholars, or at least to me as one representative thereof, to read the book of Revelation within Judaism. Its author appears to be a Jew for several reasons. First, his name, John from the Hebrew, strongly suggests that he was Jewish. Although most apocalypses are pseudonymous, I don't believe this one is. And I agree with Dionysius of Alexandria, who wrote in the middle of the 3rd century that his name is John because he says so. Which John he is, only God knows, however. This John writes his apocalypse in a Greek that seems to indicate a Semitic background, although that observation has been disputed. What has not been disputed is the fact that John alludes to the Hebrew scriptures constantly, perhaps more often than any other author of a book that will eventually be included in the New Testament canon. Monographs have been devoted to, for example, John's use of Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and he draws significantly from Genesis, Psalms, Zechariah, and more. Of course, use of the Hebrew scriptures is not even close to being definitive proof that the author is Jewish, but it does lend credence to the claim that he wrote it within Judaism. Revelation's first extant interpreter definitely read the book within Judaism. Justin Martyr, who was among the first explicitly to work with the Apocalypse, sometime around the year 155, did so in a dialogue with Trypho, a probably fictional Jewish interlocutor. When Trypho asked Justin if he really believes that Jerusalem will be rebuilt and your people, that is, Christ followers, will be gathered together with the patriarchs and prophets, Justin replies in the affirmative, although he is honest enough to admit that some true Christians think otherwise. To support his point, Justin quotes Isaiah 65 at length. There will be a new heaven and a new earth, no sadness, no hunger or thirst or displacement, a land of peace and plenty, as was also prophesied by John in his Revelation. At the end of the 2nd century, Irenaeus of Lyon also emphasized the physical fulfillment of this prophesied eschatological paradise, but it was the spiritual interpreters who won out, Christians like Bishop Dionysius of Alexandria and Origen. Dionysius, whose work is available to us only through the church history of Eusebius, wrote a treatise entitled On Promises against a chiliast named Nepos, who was also a bishop in Egypt. Eusebius notes that Nepos taught that the scriptures should be understood, quote, as the Jews understood them, unquote, with a physical millennium on earth, as he wrote in his treatise, Refutation of the Allegorists. Dionysius traveled to the region where Nepos had lived. It seems that Nepos was dead by that time, and argued with his followers. According to Eusebius, he was successful in persuading them to his position. Origen also argued against a physical conception of the kingdom in De Principiis. he writes disparagingly against those who follow the letter of Scripture alone and see the fulfillment of the promises of the future in bodily pleasure, as he puts it, in eating, drinking, living in a renewed Jerusalem, and even in marrying and begetting children. Origen sums up his argument by saying that those who believe in a literal manifestation of these promises on earth understand the scriptures in a sort of Jewish sense. Thus, Dionysius, Origen, and Eusebius set in motion a trajectory of reading the Apocalypse explicitly outside Judaism. I've looked a little bit at the earliest history of interpretation of the Apocalypse, but one of the questions we were directed to consider was, what changes when a text is read within Judaism? At the beginning of the 20th century, R.H. Charles in particular was notable for doing that, especially in his attention to reading Revelation in conversation with extra-canonical Jewish literature, which includes the so-called pseudepigrapha. Here, too, we run into almost intractable problems of terminology. Forgive me. In my own work on the Apocalypse over the last few years, I have been reading it in relation to early Enochic literature, particularly the parables of Enoch, the large middle section of what is commonly known as First Enoch. Here, of course, I'm well aware of the many intertwined complexities of dating and transmission that speak directly to the topics of this very seminar. While many sections of First Enoch can be dated securely to before the turn of the millennium, the parables cannot, but I hold that they were indeed composed sometime shortly after the death of Herod the Great. Be that as it may, although many readers, beginning with Justin Martyr, have recognized Revelation's use of the Hebrew Scriptures, relatively few have examined possible interactions with Enochic traditions. Among those who have, are Lawrence Stuckenbrook and Mark D. Matthews in their essay, The Apocalypse of John, First Enoch, and the Question of Influence. There is probably no direct literary influence of First Enoch on Revelation, but there are nonetheless significant parallels. As examples, we might delineate the parable's chosen one, soon to be called Son of Man and Messiah, who will be enthroned and worshipped by heavenly choirs, the centrality and active villainy of the kings of the earth who oppress the people of God, and most especially for my own research, the active role of the Satan in empowering both texts' villains. With the possible exception of the role of the Satan, all of these examples, Son of Man, Messiah, enthronement, the villainy of the kings of the earth, are not unique either to the parables of Enoch or to the Apocalypse of John. But their configuration in both of these texts is suggestive and warrants further investigation. Analyzing relationships between the larger literary corpus of Second Temple Judaism and the Apocalypse is one way that a focus on revelation within Judaism may bear fresh fruit.
Thank you, Leslie, and I'm happy you brought up First Enoch in the context of the Enoch seminar as we're thinking about Revelation in relationship to Judaism. All of the panelists have made their presentations. A break is of order here, as announced earlier. It's 05, wherever you may be on my watch. I suggest we resume at 20. So we'll take a 15-minute break. We have a little more time to take a rest here, and then we will resume together, continue the discussion. So see you in about 15 minutes. All right, it is 10:20. I hope you experienced eschatological renewal during your 15-minute break as we're talking about Revelation here. And some clusters of ideas and questions came to mind as I was following the very interesting presentations. We might begin with a first cluster of discussion, and of course, we'll have opportunity for further discussion beyond these clusters that I'm trying to single out here, is on the issue of supersessionism, which was brought up at the beginning with Ralph Korner's discussion. I see that some are interacting with that matter as we speak in the chat feature. Ralph, you used this term soft eschatological supersessionism, which I think is a nod there to David Novak, if I'm not mistaken, who speaks of soft supersessionism. You added the adjective eschatological supersessionism earlier in the chat feature, and I've lost some of the comments because actually my battery died and I had to get my plug, and so the chat is not saved. But I did see somebody, if I recall correctly, wondering about your incorporation of the of genealogical Israel. So I suppose Jews who already passed away or before the coming of Jesus, nevertheless being incorporated into the New Jerusalem as part of the 144,000. And I think somebody asked, well, what about the fact that in Revelation it seems that the 144,000 already followed the Lamb? I don't have exactly the text before me because I lost it in the chat feature, but I was wondering if you wanted to or can respond to that.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate the person who contributed that question. I did have further explanation in my original manuscript, but for time considerations, I had to excise it. Yeah, so, and it's not only, they're called the followers of the Lamb in chapter 7, but also even in Revelation 21, where John has said, come, I'll show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb, and he sees New Jerusalem. So there again, there's this assumption that it's they're the followers of Yeshua, the bride, the wife of the Lamb, as we see in chapter 19, that the marriage of the Lamb. But I will perhaps just big picture and then some specifics on the actual Greek text of chapter 14. Big picture is that the moniker followers of the Lamb is something that is given to them after, and I'll just use this terminology, entrance into heaven. It's not something that is given to them prior during their earthly lifetime. And you see that actually in Revelation 14, where it says those who follow the Lamb. The Greek there is a present participle, not a past tense. So it's not those who had followed the Lamb, but it's those who are following the Lamb. And the you might say eschatological time frame is that this is post-parousia. Well, this is the parousia of Christ. It's not a battle yet to be won, but this is the end of all the battles. The parousia has come, the Lamb is on Mount Zion, and the 144,000 come with the Lamb, if I might implicitly say from heaven. They are following the Lamb. Wherever he goes, they come with him. And then as you look at the scene, it's almost as if the scene goes from this earthly picture of the Lamb as sort of the parousia, he has returned, to then back to the throne room of chapter 4, where you have the imagery of the four living creatures being mentioned. Let me just find this here. Okay, so they sang the song before the throne, before the four living creatures, before the elders. No one can learn except the Lamb. So this is almost like they're back into the throne room. And again, they're not earthly. This is post-death experiences. So that's where I would frame that. And that's what I would call it. Well, if I might perhaps give honor to the person who helped me see this eschatological supersessionism term, Amy Jo Levine. Appreciate that. This really would be that once upon death, then there's a recognition of the grace of God that was in Christ, his sacrifice, providing a forensic basis for that entrance into the presence of God eternally. So in that sense, there is a supersessionist piece of recognition as Yeshua as Messiah. But as I said, functionally, I don't see that as a negative in terms of dealings with genealogy of Judea now or depicting in the future, because it does affirm the privilege of Abrahamic faith Judaioi all through all of human history since Abraham until the return of Christ, to have access into the presence of God eternally without conscious recognition of the work that Yeshua has done forensically for that purpose.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and I appreciate Leslie, you copy and pasted the question for me, so it's in the chat feature again for those who want to see that. I'm going to try to play the devil's advocate a little bit here. I mean, the devil has a visible, notable presence in the book of Revelation, so it's maybe apropos that I embrace that embodiment. For the sake of discussion, of course, there was also in the chat feature a small exchange going on between David Frankfurter and Jason Staples with respect to the, well, Paul within Judaism perspective, and your reading of Revelation as somehow combating Pauline hegemony. I'm thinking here of the work of, I think it's Peter Thompson, Paul in the Jewish Law, Halacha, in the writings of the apostolic author, something along those lines, written already in the 90s, who was arguing that, Paul does forbid Gentile followers from engaging in idololatria to a certain extent. I mean, they're not given license willy-nilly to consume sacrifices offered to idols or the like. And porneia, I think, is something that Paul is also against and singles out in his letters. If we have those two items as something being highlighted within the Paul within Judaism perspective, then how does that affect how you're reading Revelation of John as a response to people who are saying, well, we can eat food offered to idols. We can get married. Paul does give some license for marriage. What are your responses to that?
Yeah, so a lot of this is based on my timing of Revelation, which I put again 2 generations later, 2 generations after 1 Corinthians was written. Basically, the sky's the limit in terms of interpretations of that text. And when he's saying very, very kind of, in nuanced fashion, idolothuta shouldn't break this community apart, but, if you shouldn't, it's not allowed, but it shouldn't break you up. 2 generations later, people might well be taking that as license, or John of Patmos himself might be exaggerating it. The whole section about allowing marital sexuality for reasons other than procreation. Well, if I were John of Patmos and I was thinking in terms of celibacy as being the perfect angelic state of the eschatological body, it sounds like porneia to me. So I don't want to get kind of stuck in the words of Paul's letters. The point is how it would be interpreted by someone from a very different point of view halakhically 2 generations later. That's really the point. And so in the last HCR article, I suggested that really what you have in Revelation is witness to some initial collection of the letters, not a 7-fold collection. We don't know what the collection would have been, but something that will kind of signify that this position or this ideology is gaining hegemony in Asia Minor ecclesiae. And that's what he is combating, basically. That makes sense?
I think it's more like a response to Paulinism, so to speak, rather
Yes,
than
exactly.
Paul proper.
Exactly.
Is the idea of celibacy an ideal only for an elite group, the 144,000, let's say? And then, well, maybe for Paul, that also was an ideal. Not everyone has to be celibate, so that the world views are not so different between the two. I guess I'm speaking specifically about Paul now, proper,
Yeah, yeah.
and Revelation. What do you think?
Well, he does say in the first verse, he quotes someone saying it's better for you not to touch a woman. Listen, I mean, this is where I think that the comparisons with millennialist movements that were made in the 70s and 80s are really helpful here. We have to think about what it means to have an eschatological body, what it means to become an angel, what it means to kind of live in that moment between the history and the eschaton. And there are so many different things going on, and a lot of them we see in Paul's letters. These issues around what should we be doing? How should we be waiting, listening for a trumpet any minute? How should we be conducting our bodies? John of Patmos is also addressing these kinds of things, but we can't keep tabs on every single issue that's come up, but we can look at millennialist movements today in Pentecostalism, for example, where these issues, when a community enters that state of anticipation, there are a lot of issues that come up. You know, what kinds of voices should we be listening to? What kinds of tongues should we be listening to? It's a real issue, and I like to take it seriously that way.
David, are you reading the chat? There are also some questions for you.
Not yet.
Yeah,
Because,
there is a parallel conversation going on the.
No, it'll be important that you also read, you also see the chat, because there are some questions for you.
And we can come back to those questions as you
I
look
will
at them.
invite all the panelists to look at the chat, because there are continuity some, so we don't have to repeat them, and feel free to answer these questions.
Okay. I will.
Yeah. As a chair, this gives a new meaning to Samuel's term parallelomania, trying to navigate discussions that are going on. But that's nice. It's a lively feed. And of course, anyone who wants to talk, as Gabriele was saying, you can raise your virtual hand, and we'll bring you into the platform. That includes some of the participants who are attending today. Another cluster that I'm identifying here during discussion, of course, revolves around Sarah Emanuel's presentation about this nomenclature within Judaism, and I can sympathize with what you're saying, Sarah, just given my own initial impression based on what you shared. I'm remembering when my second book, Luke's Jewish Eschatology, came out. There was an anonymous reviewer who said, "Well, you should have the title Within Judaism on there," and I avoided that for some of the same premonitions that you sense and present in your paper. Having said that, I'm wondering whether, for better or for worse, whatever is going to happen, this Paul within Judaism is not going to remain restricted to the Paul within Judaism shula as we tend to think about it. I'm not saying that's something I desire or I want, but we already have some people using it. Mark Nanis, I think, has alluded to that in the chat feature. Scholars are saying, well, we can take this term within Judaism. After all, what does it mean? And it won't have this restrictive meaning. Or it will. I'm not a prophet. I'm not John the overseer to be able to predict the future. So that's one question I have in mind here is, will within Judaism remain restricted to the Paul within Judaism school as it emerged with Mark Nanis and others? The second question I have is, if I understood you correctly, you said in passing that so it comes with a certain kind of package within Pauline studies. I totally concur with that. The old perspective, the new perspective, and now we have this new perspective. But that if I misheard you, it doesn't pertain to some of the other texts of the New Testament. I do find that the works of, say, N.T. Wright, Wright has not just restricted his views about his understanding of Judaism to Paul, but has also applied it in his research on Jesus. And at least in my own research, I was also responding to Wright his interpretation of the synoptics, where he's also blaming, so to speak, Jews for being ethnocentric, using the phrases idolatrous nationalism. And so I am wondering, for the sake of discussion, whether this within Judaism phrase might still be useful even for other non-Pauline texts. So those are just like two responses I throw out there. I don't want, of course, to be the only one responding to your very stimulating presentation, which I'm happy you brought this up so that we can have a nice discussion.
Yeah, can I respond briefly? And then, I mean, you're raising two really important points, and I think it's already happened. I think it's clear that it's beyond Paul, and that we're using within Judaism differently, as both Mark and Gabriela have written within the chat. It's being used differently than its particular sort of framing in the Paul within Judaism school. And obviously, I mean, I am perhaps one of the biggest proponents of thinking about the New Testament in relation to Jewishness, including ancient Jewish contexts. And so I may just have to get on board with this. But the reason that I may be coming across as so adamant is that I don't want us to bypass the conversation of the term's history. And I think perhaps we've done that. I think we've just heard within Judaism and have gone with it without taking time to think about the term's history, which has a very rich history in Paul studies. With regards to the frameworks, new perspective, what I meant by new perspective, old perspective and new perspective not existing in other conversations of New Testament texts. I don't mean necessarily that the general ethos of, old perspective kind of ideas and new perspective kind of ideas don't exist elsewhere. What I mean is that there's not a term. We don't have something like old perspective of Revelation, but I'm worried that if we bring, say, Revelation, we call it Revelation within Judaism, might perspectives such as Arch Charles was brought up, F.C. Bauer, might we start giving those ideas a name, and then scholars can come into Revelation studies and say, oh, I'm of that school. Like, that's what I mean by kind of like solidifying frameworks. Might it I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but might in a roundabout way bring about these other frameworks. But then I also really want to add on to that what AJ also commented on in the chat, which is very much part of my concern. I'm really worried that within Judaism loose framing, beyond Paul within Judaism, the only way we're thinking about it often is in a way that makes modern Christian ethics or modern Christians feel good about the New Testament. Right? Like, we're going to make Paul a good Jew for Jews to make Christians feel better in a post-Holocaust world. We're going to make, and that's why I really appreciate Rebecca's comments on Revelation, because it seems like she's not afraid to get into the stickiness. She's wanting to broaden within Judaism to get into the stickiness. So I'll stop there.
Oh yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm worried too that we might, we don't want any term can lead to potential restrictions and even stagnation. So I really share that concern. Rebecca, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a really quick comment on that, kind of thinking back to the earlier iteration of this within Judaism conference, something that came up I think at the very end. It was sort of like, well, what is the point of doing this? For whom are we doing this within Judaism perspective? Is it for our scholarly community, for people who are having these conversations about this text? Is it for particular religious communities outside there who have bad readings or okay readings and want to correct? Or like, so for whom is this term? I think that seems to be implicit in a lot of these conversations. And I think, for Revelation, there are a very particular set of conversations that we don't have this sort of Pauline history, but we do have a much lengthier history of a text that has been read in very universalistic, dangerous sorts of ways. And so the question is for what is the term for, and who are we trying to talk to, and are we trying to convince them of something? So this is kind of what I've mulling over, and I'd be curious to hear what the other panelists have to say.
Sometimes we might have multiple audiences in mind, right? And it's very hard to be able to accommodate all of those competing interests. Within Judaism definitely makes for a nice title on a book cover. And I think that was what the publishers were wanting from me. David, would you like to respond to some of the questions that were already raised in the chat feature? The floor is yours in any case.
No, I just wanted to continue with Sarah's point because I think it's always a really interesting question. Why now for any inquiry? I wanted to say that when I first got into the so-called Jews a long time ago, Revelation was a Christian text, and people read everything in heaven as being Christian, and the Jews who say they are Jews but are not were Jews who weren't Christian enough. And I felt that the entire field on Revelation was just stuck in this kind of post-Handel's Messiah mode of like the glory of the end times and the revelation of the Lamb. And yet, from the kind of Princeton perspective that Rebecca also came out of, this was a Jewish text that had these multiple heavenly mediators, and I felt that there was that the within Judaism approach was a liberating approach. It liberated the text to be read in multiple different ways, and of course, it allows people like Corner to create another theology, a post-supersessionist theology. But I think for the rest of us who are interested in history and literature, it does release us. And in terms of why now, since the 1980s, there has been the progressive rise of white supremacist millennialist groups that have made Revelation into a kind of realized event for the entire contemporary American politics. To read this in a Jewish sense, in some ways, sidesteps that kind of ideology, which is very much in control of the government right now. So.
Thanks for sharing that. It does resonate what you say with me. It's too bad John Marshall wasn't able to join us today, because when I was working on my PhD dissertation, reading his work on Revelation, where he was just saying, let's just call it a Jewish text, and let's see where that takes us. Really influenced my own work, reading Matthew and Luke, Acts as Jewish texts. And I remember a professor from Michigan State asking me, "Oh, so what's your dissertation about?" I was like, "Well, I'm trying to say Matthew and Luke are Jewish texts." And the follow-up was, "Well, so what? What's the takeaway of saying that a text is Jewish?" And I would say, well, it makes a difference much in every way. Suddenly we look at all kinds of matters that are within the contents of these texts in a very different, I think, new enlightening way. Instead of saying, oh, this text might be against purity laws, suddenly it's part of a wider discussion about purity matters or Sabbath practice, or even Israel, the whole concept of Israel. What is Israel? The restoration of Israel. So there are benefits. At the same time, time will tell where this is going to take us. So Gabriele, your hand has been raised for a while. I know that Jason Staples has also joined the panel, and then there is Leslie. So maybe we'll go in that order.
Put Leslie before me for sure. She's been here longer with her hand up. Definitely.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that. My apologies. Gabriele.
No, I mean, I raised this question in the chat because, I mean, in scholarship is common that we have a term that has been for a long time around. Okay, because, I mean, when I was a student at university, I was already reading books that were titled Jesus within Judaism, John the Baptist within Judaism. So this phrase was already around, I mean, for a long time in articles, books, etc. What is the real question is why now this term has exploded. I mean, it happens continuously in the history of scholarship that a term that was, I mean, we never invent something completely new. I mean, we always discover that something was already used before us. I mean, by some. And I think that, of course, because of a particular Paul within Judaism school that had a great impact, but also because this idea in general of a diversity of Second Temple Judaism, the inclusion of Christianity as one of the messianic and apocalyptic movements within Judaism, the emphasis on reading this text, a Jewish text, against a tradition that read this text against Judaism or as post-Jewish text. So we discussed a lot. I remember also in January all these theoretical questions, and there are pros because, of course, it's a very effective phrase. I mean, people immediately feel something new. I mean, and on the other hand, I think you are perfectly right. I remember Adele Reinhardt also put this point very strongly. I mean, it cannot be an easy way to absolve Christianity from anti-Judaism, or even to absolve ancient Christian text from anti-Jewish, for being the source of anti-Judaism, simply because they are all Jewish. Okay, so we have a lot of problems. What is good for me is that the term within Judaism is now going beyond the discussion on Paul. And second, that is becoming more and more diverse. I mean, I consider myself a scholar that is reading Paul, is published on Paul within Judaism, but certainly my position on Paul is not exactly the same of some other my colleagues, even though we all define ourselves as Paul within Judaism scholars. So are good development, and I hope this conference, this series of conference, will strengthen exactly this point. Okay, that we're dealing with something broader, something that. And I agree also on a point that David did at the beginning when he said Revelation is not like the Gospel of John in terms of his relation to Jewishness, or in terms of his approach from within Judaism, instead of being in a sort of sectarian mode. Okay. I think that the real challenge for applying the term within Judaism to New Testament text is the Gospel of John, which is very problematic, and also texts that are after the Gospel of John. So we have still to clarify when a text is no longer within Judaism, which will be an equally important problem to define.
Hey, thank you, Gabriele. Yeah, and you raise a good point as to why is this phrase being used so much. I guess the Enoch seminar is partly to be blamed by holding a entire conference on this matter. You know, that said, I'm always wondering whether we're just one moment in the history of scholarship, and people will look back and be able to see a certain tendency already in what we're doing. I'd like to think, nevertheless, that there's some merit in reading these texts as Jewish texts. Maybe I kind of prefer to say as Jewish text or Jewish text than the phrase within Judaism. So kind of concur with what Sarah and Manu was bringing here. And Sarah already has brought our attention to James Crosland.
No, just a short. Remember when we had the conference on Paul within Judaism in 2014, the Enoch Seminar Conference in Rome?
Mm-hmm.
Two books of proceedings came. There are a lot of material, so we had to write two books. Okay, and one was titled Paul within Judaism, and the other was titled Paul the Jew, or Paul
the
as
second temple Jew.
The second temple Jew we didn't do on purpose, but of course these two kind of languages has been around, and to a certain extent needs to be put together in relation to one another. But I agree. I mean, there are this kind of within Judaism tendency is made of different trains of different souls, if you like. Top.
Yeah, thanks for that. Leslie.
All right, I have to go back about 10 minutes. So back to a comment by Lynn Huber in the chat. Lynn is responding to Rebecca, and in my comments here, I also want to include what Sarah was saying about some of the implications of the within Judaism phrase. So Lynn wrote about situating, why the practice of situating ourselves as interpreters is important. Sometimes that says a lot about how we're using the terms, et cetera, et cetera. And it just struck me that somehow something very important was left out of the paper as I presented it here. And that is, of course, that while Justin is trying to interpret revelation within Judaism, he is again, right?
You cut off just briefly, at least from my end, with the last sentence.
Sorry, we have thunderstorms coming
Oh,
in, and you guys have been going in and out for me too.
It was right when you said he was interpreting Judaism within.
Okay. Justin was interpreting Revelation within Judaism, specifically to use Revelation as a weapon against a Jew. And where we place ourselves as interpreters, Justin is setting himself quite explicitly as an antagonist. And while he obviously isn't using the term within Judaism, I would say that he is doing so, but he's doing it in a way to denigrate and destroy a particular fictional Jew, and probably Jews as he thinks of them as a whole, at least as they interpret scripture.
thanks for sharing that. Yeah, as I've said before, we need to deal with Justin Martyr. Many people have brought up Justin Martyr, and so we're planning on that for this fall in September. Kelly, I think Kelly, yes, you had your hand raised.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I want to just share my appreciation for all of the presentations. I really appreciated Leslie calling attention to the parables. And I have to say that in terms of my reading of Revelation and my reading of the parables, I found reading the two together very illuminating. And I have moved in terms of how I think about the dating of the parables as a result. And I think it was Michael Knibb at the 2005 Enoch seminar who wanted to leave the door open for imagining a slightly later dating of Revelation, I'm sorry, of the parables of Enoch. And I see the case today. And I'm interested also because I've been following the work of Grant McCaskill on the parables of Enoch, and he's been looking at the date even beyond end of the first century CE. And I really appreciate how he's working with the parables and thinking about the messiness of categories and in terms of how we try to identify an audience or an author for that text. And I guess it brought me back around to the presentation of Sarah, just thinking about our use of categories and how we reify them in ways that aren't really historical and maybe misread the text further. And to the issue of misreading, I appreciate very much the question, why now? And I agree with everything that has been shared, and also just the keen insights of the damage Revelation and misreadings of Revelation have done to others. And I think that there's a special interest for many of us in discussing Revelation because of the spectacular and dangerous misreadings of this text that just flood popular culture and make Revelation potentially, well, can render Revelation a dangerous text. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And Ralph, we'll go back to you. There is a one other question, a different cluster of questions before I give you the mic, Ralph, and then Sarah. It seems to me like my sentiment here is we're not discussing whether Revelation is a Jewish text. I sense there's a sort of consensus that, yeah, we can read it as a Jewish text, which I find interesting because that hasn't been or still isn't quite the case with, say, Mark, or even Paul. There are some contention points with Paul over Torah praxis, over the status of the Gentiles in Christ. So I find that interesting. And there's some creative wordplay going on in the chat feature about, well, is it within Judaism, within Judaisms, within meta-Judaism? I'm seeing all kinds of things going on there. I'm thinking of Rebecca Hayes' presentation, which compared Revelation with the War Scroll. Are we prepared to maybe even pinpoint further where this book belongs within the Judaic mosaic? So that's maybe something we can come to after we hear comments from Rolf and then Sarah.
Thanks, Isaac. Yeah, I just want to reflect back to what Dave was saying and just what Kelly shared in terms of rescuing Revelation from popular misconceptions and readings today, and frame that more so into Revelation's counter-imperial stream, which we haven't really discussed much. But obviously, that's another real factor in considering a revelation within Judaismos is this perception of Rome. This is the other Babylon. They, destroyed the temple. Very Jewish kinds of perception, the war scroll against the Kittim, the Romans. And I think recapturing some of that as we do our scholarship and deal with these popular misperceptions forces people to reframe Revelation in the first century sociocultural realities, recognizing, some of the misinterpretations and applications really don't have any footing. And just one quick thing, the New Jerusalem, you might say, because of its massive size, literally 1,500 miles, cubic, unfathomable in that modern era, even in our era, really re-engages the Ezekiel 38 and Jubilees 8 framing of Jerusalem as a navel of the earth. Rome is a smoking crater, and the New Jerusalem is the navel of the earth. Everything's recentered around the New Jerusalem. And so I think some of these elements are helpful ways of re-engaging people with the first century realities and the expected, I will say, non-physical eschatological expectations on the New Jerusalem.
Okay, yes. Sarah, and then I did forget Jason in the meantime, but we'll come to you after Jason.
So sorry, I'll be quick, Jason. I just want to add a sort of additional earnest, difficult piece to the conversation in and around who is this for and what are we trying to do in our current now? Who are we as interpreters? And I don't want to get too in the weeds into identity politics, but the fact of the matter remains that a part of what we can do with this, at least particularly I think in the classroom, sometimes also comes down to how our students perceive us. And so, for example, I am someone who teaches with the Jewish annotated New Testament. I do the very work constantly that we are doing here. And if a student finds out that I'm Jewish, it can significantly backfire. To the point that last semester, I had a graduate student buy a book on how to combat Pharisaic thinking, linking me to Pharisees. Like, the only reason I'm teaching this is because I must be Jewish. So even in trying, we're saying, oh, this helps so many people understand the Jewish context and combat anti-Judaism. Not always.
Relate to that sometimes with the student comments I've gotten. Occasionally it happens. Thanks for sharing that. Jason.
Yeah, a couple things here. One is thanks to David for engaging with my comments earlier. and questions there. I do think that there's some compelling stuff in that comparison, and I think thinking about this in the sense of Paulinism versus Paul himself is at least more persuasive to me. I just wonder whether or not we have any evidence of Christians in the Pauline stream of things who are doing those sorts of things at that stage, or the people who are interpreting Paul in those directions. Because everything that I see from, say, the Pauline tradition, the post-Paul Pauline tradition, say the pastoral epistles, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, these sorts of things. The idea that people would eat idol meat in those it seems to me to be, completely out of the question. And what we see in early Gentile Christianity is a very, very strong reaction against that sort of thing. So in that context, I do wonder if Revelation is written, say, late first century. I wonder who it's actually targeting in that context within the Pauline stream. And so that's sort of the source of some of my skepticism there. But again, I think it's plausible, and I think that some strong arguments have been made there. I just I'm to some degree playing devil's advocate there. I do though want to do a little bit of bomb throwing in terms of textual questions here, or I guess interpretive questions that are worth thinking about in terms of the text itself when thought through a revelation within the context of first century Judaism context. I've become about 15 years ago, I came to the conclusion, maybe 20 years ago now, came to the conclusion that Mystery Babylon, that the woman in Revelation who's riding the beast in 17 is the same woman as chapter 12, and that woman is best understood as earthly Jerusalem. Over and against the New Jerusalem, who comes out, and that woman sees herself as queen. She's guilty of a double sin. She's right. I see it as Jerusalem in bed with Rome, essentially, and then she's burned with fire by the very beast that she's in bed with, etc. And that this is actually engaging with the events of 70, and portraying that as at odds, the fate of earthly Jerusalem versus the heavenly Jerusalem that will then replace earthly Jerusalem. Now, I wonder, I mean, that strikes me as a very sort of within Judaism kind of move. At the same point, you're getting some of the heavenly versus earthly Jerusalem stuff that you get in, later interpreters who are pulling that from Paul and elsewhere. But I'm curious what I know there are a couple of Italian articles from the last 10 or 12 years that have gone in that direction, and I think Maloney's commentary went in that direction as well, but not none of them, I think, really fully plumbing the depths of what that might do, and especially reading that within Judaism. I'm actually just curious to get some reactions or responses from this group, which I think is especially well attuned to kind of consider within Judaism implications of that kind of reading, because I don't think it makes sense to read the woman as Rome and the beast is also Rome. It's like Rome riding Rome. I think this makes a lot more sense.
Does anyone want to respond to that? Maybe also Revelation 11, the great city there. I don't know if I think that's also a sticking point in the conversation about the identity of that city. Also, what are you thinking? Yes, go ahead, Ralph.
Yeah, perhaps I'll offer a couple of comments. I think the Revelation 11, it clearly appears to be Jerusalem, because it talks there the city where their Lord was crucified. So it's sort of hard to go beyond that identification. And it's destroyed by an earthquake at that particular point of time. And then we see in chapter 16, verse 19, in the seventh bowl, the same earthquake revisiting again, but this time it's Babylon that's destroyed. And then in chapter 18, it talks there about Babylon and its fall. It says in 1 hour, it has become, it's smoking crater, basically. implying again that this earthquake is being referenced again. And even if just from the perspective of this reiterative earthquake, or coming at this earthquake and seeing its implications from many different angles, we don't necessarily need to equate the chapter 11 vision of Jerusalem being destroyed with the Babylon being destroyed in chapter 16. It could be, again, the earthquake is the central motif, and it's just explicating in different directions some of the implications of that. And it sort of reminds me, because there is this, I know, Jason, I totally see this, it's almost this amorphous, what is this city that, and there is that mystery in it. And it reminds me a bit of Isaiah 24, wherein you have this city that's mentioned, and scholars will look at it and say, well, what is this city? Is it Jerusalem? Is it Babylon? Is it the Assyrians? Like, because it seems like you can apply them. So it almost like this multivalent kind of meaning. And that's not unusual with apocalyptic literature. Clarity is not the concern of apocalyptic literature. It's engaging the personhood of the reader into some sort of a motivational response. And mystery tends to engage people. It's not just this rational document we're reading. So, I mean, just some comments in that direction in terms of identifying the city, that I think there's this multivalent, and the earthquake in terms of a textual device helps center some differentiation, but yet similar timing of that potential fall of each. And one other quick comment maybe on the is Rome writing Rome. As I understand it, some scholars look at the Babylon not as Rome, the city, but as Dea Roma, the goddess of Rome. And that the seven-headed beast, when it says in Revelation 17:9 that the seven heads of the beast are the seven hills or mountains, the word's a little ambiguous there, which basically identifies Rome as the seven hills. Vespasian's coin that was minted in 71 CE shows Dea Roma as a woman sitting on seven hills, and you've got Romulus and Remus there. And so it's very definitely this Roman imperium, not just the Roman city kind of perspective, religio, political, military, historical, all being referenced. So there's some comments for perhaps reflection.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I don't know if there were other panelists who wanted to address Jason's question. What I was also going to raise here, bearing in mind the previous question also, what kind of Judaism is revelation, and not wanting to have new a prioris become cemented in our thinking, reflection about Revelation as a Jewish text, knowing that also people are watching this that belong to other communities besides the academic one. Perhaps it might be worthwhile just reciting, because this will be uploaded later to the Enoch Seminar YouTube channel, and others will continue to watch this in the public space. Why is it that the the so-called Jews, right, that are being blamed in at the beginning of Revelation, why can't they be Jews? And I know for us here, there's an assumption, it seems clear what the arguments are for saying these are maybe Pauline leaning or Paulinist leaning Christians. But for a general audience, that might strike them as odd. Why not say that these Jews of the synagogue of Satan, however infamous that may be, were actual Jews from the first century somewhere in Asia Minor? Should we maybe just lay out a bit the arguments? Sarah.
I think they can be. And I tried to insinuate this in my talk in relation to some of the things Rebecca is raising. I think that those with whom John agrees in the Jewish world are really limited. He's arguing for the right kind of Jewishness, I think, and trying to, persuade those to hold fast to his idea of what the best kind of Jewishness is, and maybe persuade others to join in, or else he'll be burned alive for all eternity. and so they can be other Jews, just not the right kinds of Jews from John's perspective. So I think it could be either. But I find it so intriguing that for some reason when it comes to this conversation, we go to Paul and we think that like is John's community different from Paul, or is John thinking differently from Paul? I see them as really similar Jewish thinkers trying to bring about a very particular Jewish nationalistic end of days. And Paul is just trying to usher in non-Jews in a different way from John. But at the very end of Revelation, non-Jews are there in the New Jerusalem. They seem to be enslaved, perhaps, which is also part of some Jewish messianic orientations. But I don't think Paul and John are necessarily doing much different.
Thanks for that. Rebecca?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, one of the comments I had said in my talk was that it could be an inter-Jewish conversation as well. And I think maybe the way to think about that would be, again, in comparison to the Qumran sect, and sect might be the key word here. If we think of maybe not all of this early Jesus movement, but maybe the Jesus movement that John is involved in as a sect, as a sectarian Jewish movement, it's doing things that at Qumran they're also doing, right? Like there's good Jews and there's bad Jews. There's insiders and there's outsiders, and it's very vitriolic. And you could imagine if the Qumranites were writing in Greek that they might use very similar language, possibly. So I think there is a case to be made. I just think we just don't know for sure. So I think we should remain open, which is a theme of a lot of our conversations, to a multiplicity of possibilities for this text and others.
So maybe revelation within sectarian Judaism, which is making me think of John Campian's work with respect to Matthew within sectarian Judaism, bearing that title, where he interacted a lot with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll go with David and then Ralph.
Yeah, since I thought of the Pauline enemy model, I'll take responsibility for it. It's very difficult to model what the enemies of John are, and it is actually rather convenient that pretending to be a Jew or calling yourself a Jew does come up in Romans, for example. Now, of course, again, Paul doesn't approve of it, but it seemed more sensible to me historically to go with what John of Patmos is actually saying. Those who say they are Jews but are not, but are an assembly of Satan. So I do find it more sensible in terms of kind of all the options to go with a Gentile who has come to call himself or herself a Jew for some reason in the anticipation of the eschaton, and that model is presaged by Paul's letters from 3 generations earlier.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think one of the arguments there is, those who call themselves Jews and are not. And so that presumably, well, who would call themselves Jews if they weren't Jewish? And so that raises the possibility that we're not actually dealing with non-Jews. I know this is like a basic observation that I'm making, but just for the sake of a wider audience listening to our conversation, it's a different dynamic doing these virtual seminars than being at SBL, for example, where it's more of an intimate setting, we might say. People are eavesdropping and watching what we're saying. We'll go to Ralph.
Great. Yeah, to enter into that conversation of who's the Jew, I concur with David that it's not Jews per se, genealogical Jews, because they're called Jews moniker. I would differ with David in saying it's not a Pauline community; it's a non-Pauline community. And some reasons and it's non-Pauline community of Gentile God-fearers who came to Christ, faith in Christ, and who now are Judaizing, and that is what John is reacting against. And the part of the rationale for the non-Pauline is, first of all, they're called the synagogue of Satan. The Greek word synagogue doesn't have to be translated synagogue. Its base meaning is assembly, and I think it's really doing disservice when we translate it as synagogue. We should translate it as assembly. Same thing, with the reverse thing actually, in James, where the word synagogue occurs, and we don't translate it synagogue, we translate it assembly. In your assembly, and who wants to read that James as Christ followers are meeting in a synagogue? So the translators have reversed that sense. But all that to say, Pauline Christ followers would not have been called synagogae; they were called ecclesiae. And I think right there's a note that muddies the waters for John's audience, identifying who this was. If he's really intending Pauline Christ followers, he would have called them an ecclesia of Satan, in terms of the terminological use, around there. This is one point. If you would like, Isaac, I have a slide that just quickly shows the lay of the land of who say it is Jews and how they sort of interpret that. And we could it's a quick one slide summary. If you want, I can quickly walk that through.
If you're able to, yeah, we have time still. It is 16, so there's still plenty of time to, if it's brief, and you're able to share your screen, if that feature's still enabled. Yeah, go ahead.
So in essence, here's what I've discovered in the research anyway. So the not Judaioi, if we read that phrase in a later inscription in Smyrna, in Hadrian's reign, there's this inscription that talks about the hoi pata Judaioi, the former Jews. And Crabble has suggested two possible ways of looking at that. One is that these are now no longer a legal political entity called Jew. They have lost their political status as a Jewish privilege in their city. So it's and the other way is just saying that they're not Judeans. So Steve Mason, of course, highlighted how Judaioi could be translated Judeans over against Jews. And Crowell is just saying this could just basically saying they've emigrated. They're no longer Judeans. They're now in Smyrna. They're Smyrnians, and perhaps have citizenship within Smyrna, because Crowell says in Ionian cities, Smyrna being one of them, Jews could gain citizenship and gain political privilege as a result. The second one, Crowell identifies as not religiously faithful Jews. So that as citizens, if they were citizens, part of that citizenship, a requirement would be acknowledging the imperial cult and participating in some fashion. And so they would have participated, thus are not religiously faithful Jews. And thus they're called the synagogue or assembly of Satan, because they have aligned themselves with satanic Rome in that sense. Or they're not ethically faithful Jews. And this is Hirschberg basically saying that they, in their isolationism and you might say pride of privilege in terms of their national identity, they are not living shalom in their community, but are actually creating division between them and other Greeks in the city who might have been not too, how do you say, supportive of them becoming citizens. So from that political citizenship point of view, those are some of the aspects. The not Judaioi as Christ followers, Christos followers. David Frankfurt is well identified, his basic perspective, and that's the one there. Eileen Pagels also falls into that category. Leonard Thompson wrote the Abingdon Press Revelation commentary. He suggests it's non-Pauline Judaizing Jews. And I suggest it's non-Pauline Judaizing God-fearers who are not legally Jews. And that basically following Thiessen there with the sense of the law of circumcision, that yes, they're perhaps circumcised. If they were circumcised, they still wouldn't be legal Jews. But if they're not circumcised, it would actually fit well with later perceptions in Smyrna of uncircumcised Gentiles who were Judaizing. And so those are basically, and then us perhaps the blasphemy or the slander would be that these non-Pauline God-fearers are forcing Torah observance on non-Judaioi, which for Paul at least, of course, is anathema. And is John in the same category? We don't know, but perhaps that might be a reference. So that's a quick overall summary.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for sharing. That's helpful. Lay out all the possibilities there for us. I think, James, you did have your hand raised earlier on.
We do also have
When I
Brandon.
when I put my hand down, you should ignore that I had my hand up earlier. I think that's the polite
Okay.
thing to do. Yeah, I stuck my thought in the chat. I can't even remember what it was because we've been chatting about other things since then.
Okay. Got you. So is my impression correct? There is a sort of consensus here. Revelation is a Jewish text. Uh, so let me complicate that if I can a bit. Maybe not as the devil's advocate, more in a Talmudic fashion. Urminhu, I'm going to raise a contradiction. The New Jerusalem doesn't have a temple. Can we speak of something within Judaism without the temple? I mean, just throwing that out there. What are the responses as an exercise?
I mean, the folks in the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to think of themselves as an alternative temple. I think that again, we've already seen the parallels multiple times here with things like the War Scroll and elsewhere. I think this is just another place where Revelation is very within that kind of strain of sectarian Judaism. And again, this is part of why I'm so persuaded by the interpretation of the heavenly versus earthly Jerusalem aspect as really central to what's going on in Revelation. That is a polemic against exactly that sort of thing. That this is an alternative temple structure. That the New Jerusalem, as pointed out already, is a people, not so much a place in that respect. And that people is itself the temple. I don't think it's it's different from what we see in some of those other sectarian elements. So I would strongly put it within that. Actually doesn't make it any less within Judaism in that respect.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, just to build on that, Jason, I think I made this point in a previous conversation about Revelation, but even in the beginning in the letters, humans are personified as parts of the temple, right? So you have the menorah, that's a community, and if the menorah is removed, you remove. So there's sort of like the people, and then there's the writing on the pillars, if your name will be on the pillar. So in very much kind of like a Qumran fashion, you sort of personify or become the temple in a very materialized, an imaginary materialized kind of way. So yes, I would very much agree with you.
Yeah, I concur fully with where Jason and Rebecca have gone, in that the New Jerusalem is cast very explicitly as the temple, not the temple proper, but the Holy of Holies. And so the cubic shape right away would have reminded a Jewish listener of the shape of the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, which was 10 cubits cubed, or the Solomonic temple, which is 20 cubits cubed. And I think it's important that it's the Holy of Holies that's represented, not the temple precinct at large, because the Holy of Holies is representative of the full presence of God. And so in that imagery, John is communicating that the people, as the Holy of Holies, are fully in the presence. God's presence is fully available to them. There's no little nook and cranny. They're not in a mansion somewhere, out of God's presence. It's like eternally in the presence of God, completely and fully, as the New Jerusalem. I think is really what's the imagery can be communicating there. And it accords well with Qumran. Obviously, 1QS 8, where they talk about they're the foundation. No, they're the foundation of the Holy of Holies of Aaron, and the Pesher on Isaiah 54, where the Council of Yahad is cast as the foundation of the New Jerusalem. So a lot of interconnectivity into Judaismos, sectarian Judaism.
There's some discussion going on in the chat about universalism versus nationalism. Does Revelation support Jewish nationalism, whatever the term nationalism may mean? And then, or is it a Jewish universalism? And I know there's a lot of discussion about this kind of discourse. Maybe we can address this matter here, and then I do see somebody else wants to speak from outside our panel, which we'll try to bring the person in. Anyone? Universalist? Nationalist? I know that's a big question. Sarah?
I don't use the word universalism in relation to anything really. I don't know if it actually really exists. It's all at the end of the day, so much is actually particular. So we're talking about texts that are centering a Jewish God, a Jewish Christ, entering a Jewish eschaton. It seems very much to favor the particularism of Jewishness, even if non-Jews are sometimes they're not even welcome in. They're just trying to fulfill some kind of messianic hope. Again, I don't think the Gentiles at the end of Revelation are necessarily there by choice. So I do think Revelation, and I also think Paul, as I said, is very much okay with imagining an end of days that is very much in what we might call a Jewish, nationalist kind of place. Would Jews at the top. I mean, especially if we're reading Revelation as Jewish, and if we're reading Revelation as advocating for being a particular kind of Jew, I mean, it's particular all the way down. Then it's an end of days that sure may have non-Jews in it, but a particular way of being Jewish is at the top.
The word nationalism, it comes with certain connotations, right? We think of bayonets, cannons, military parades, and so forth. So we have to bear in mind what these terms mean. James.
Yeah, since I think I sparked that last bit of discussion, I think, with some things I put in the comments in the chat. Yeah, it was just me trying to respond to the really excellent point that Sarah in particular had made, but also others, that, and it goes back to things that, I recall AJ Levine saying about the fact that, through a Christian lens, if you are being particularistic, if you are like, I want to keep, keeping the Jewish Torah, right, means something to me, that is, viewed negatively within the framework of this, pro-universalism reading of New Testament texts, right? So it's within Judaism, but it's universalistic. And it seems to me that framing it in terms of a universalism that invites everyone essentially to get on board with the particularity of Jewishness, not all in the same way and not all by converting, but in some way recognizing the superiority of Israel's God and of the truth, might be a way of thinking about what we're trying to get at through the terminology and the enterprise we call within Judaism, but avoid some of the pitfalls of what Sarah highlighted earlier today about the new perspective.
We are kind of reaching towards the end of our discussion. For me, it's been very interesting to see how this Revelation panel played out, thinking of it in comparison to the Mark panel and the Paul panel. Seems like there was a consensus. There were some debating points as to, who are the enemies that the author is attacking. Are they Pauline enemies? Are they Jews from the diaspora, etc.? The nomenclature within Judaism, its usage, and what that means. But overall, sounds like with Revelation, we're pretty happy with the hermeneutical potential of reading it as a Jewish text. And so I take that as one of the major takeaways from this session. I don't know if anybody wants to offer some final remarks before we go on a hiatus for the rest of the summer and then resume with the second half of this conference, reading the New Testament within Judaism, ?
Maybe, Isaac, the opportunity of some general consideration, considering the 3 days of the conference, because, for instance, I was, I mean, maybe we pick up 3 documents that, that were easy. I don't know. I mean, for me, dealing with the Jewishness of Paul, Mark, and Revelation looks quite obvious. I mean, I know that in September we have much more problematic documents. Okay, because if we are dealing with the Gospel of John, or we are dealing with Justin, or the letter of Barnabas, I don't know. I mean, here is where the problems come, because of course we cannot claim that all Christian documents until the 5th century are all Jewish texts. Of course. So for us, the tricky part is just to understand, as we repeated several times in these days, when a controversy that was made at the beginning from within the family, sometimes even in very strong terms, I mean, against other groups of Jews, became instead a controversy against the Jews. I mean, when I talk to my students, I always say, look, in the gospel, or when you talk about Paul and the Jews, or Mark and the Jews, or Matthew and the Jews, or Luke and the Jews, you have always to say Paul and the other Jews, or Mark and the other Jews, because I mean it doesn't make any sense to talk of Paul and the Jews, or Mark and the Jews. Okay, so this is already a big difference. But for me, the major question is when the other Jews became the Jews. All the Jews, and so we are talking not from within the family, but from outside the family. Okay, and I see also a gradual process. I mean, in my opinion, the Gospel of John is still in a transition, because is an extreme form of Jewish sectarianism more than a non-Jewish text. But of course, this is something that we have to explore patiently, step by step. But I repeat, maybe we pick up the easy document for this June conference. And I'm very pleased that we all emphasized the positive implications of this new perspective of not only of reading this text in relation with Judaism, but as part of Judaism. For me, for instance, another important implication would be how these three texts influence the history of Judaism. Because I don't like this idea of taking the Second Temple Judaism as a sort of background and then to isolate Christian texts. I mean, Christian texts were part of a conversation, so they also influenced the other Jewish groups of the time in a dramatic way. And this is something that we have probably never done in a systematic way.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, we started with Paul within Judaism naturally, so that's sort of like what one of the main triggers that has led to this momentum of studying these texts as Jewish texts. And then we had a lot of solicitation as to like, hey, you should have something on Mark, you should have something on Revelation. People have asked also about Hebrews. Why haven't you talked about Hebrews? So we'll have a panel on Hebrews in the fall. But it has been a wonderful panel. I want to thank all of the contributors for today's conference. I wish to also thank the board of directors of the Enoch Seminar, the vice directors, for their input when needed. Last but not least, we should give a special thanks to Megan Wines, the new secretary of the Enoch Seminar, who has made this Zoom event logistically possible. Thank you, Megan. So we are going to wrap up the discussion now and this first half of the conference. Stay in touch.
Thank you to Isaac. Isaac, thank you to you, because you have been
yes.
the driving force for this 3-day conference in the organization and also in leading the discussion. So we are very, very thankful for your contribution and your leadership.
Appreciate that. So we will have these recordings later uploaded to the YouTube channel on the Enoch seminar. So don't hesitate to spread the word, thinking about what Bernadette Bruden has brought up. How can we make our presence more visible? We're trying to do that. Otherwise, I wish you a good end of your day, evening, night, morning, wherever you may be. Thank you again for joining us, and see you hopefully in September.
And thanks to the many people that have been so patient to be with us all these 3 days, the many, many people. So we are very, very pleased. Thank you.